The Venerable Bede began his account of the history of the English Church, completed in 731 AD, with the Roman conquest of Britain. Although he lacked the insights provided by modern archaeology, Bede still had access to many of the same literary sources we use today. Moreover, the landscape he lived in was dotted with the ruins of Roman structures, leaving a visible legacy that shaped his understanding of the past. Near his monastery at Jarrow, just south of the river Tyne, the presence of Hadrian's Wall, with its accompanying ditch, road, forts, and mile castles, was a powerful reminder of Rome's reach. Bede knew this landscape well. When he traveled to York, he would have seen the towering walls and imposing Roman buildings, some still roofed, dominating the bishop's church. Much of the stone used to build grand monastic churches came from Roman remains, like the bridge abutment at Corbridge on the Tyne, which Bishop Wilfrid repurposed to construct the church at Hexham. The influence of the Roman Church was also central in Bede's world. Rome represented the heart of the Western Church, a center of authority, tradition, and orthodoxy. It was from there that Augustine of Canterbury had been sent to lead the Christian mission in England. By the late 7th and early 8th centuries, English clerics saw themselves as defenders of Roman Christianity, determined to root out heresy and restore the Roman Church's presence in Britain. For Bede, this strong contemporary connection with Roman Christianity deeply shaped his view of the earlier Roman period, coloring it as a time of unity and religious foundation. Even today, the Roman period still serves as a natural starting point for any exploration of Anglo-Saxon England. How we interpret the nature of Roman Britain, how we imagine its decline, and the way we understand what followed in the sub-Roman period all shape our broader understanding of the early medieval era. Over the past century, views of Roman Britain have shifted considerably. In the early 1900s, Rome was admired as a civilizing force, bringing order to a barbaric island. But in more recent decades, the Roman Empire has been seen through a more critical lens, as a militarized regime that exploited the territories and people under its control. As Britain's own empire unraveled, so too did the idealized image of Rome begin to fade. In broad strokes, the Roman history of Britain is relatively straightforward. The island lay just beyond the borders of Julius Caesar's conquests in Gaul during the 50s BC. He launched expeditions across the Channel in 55 and 54 BC, but permanent Roman rule did not begin until the invasion under Emperor Claudius in AD 43. The conquest was gradual, taking many decades to fully control the island and its resources, which Roman writers like Tacitus described as rich. In reality, however, Britain likely drained more from the empire than it contributed. Although Roman Britain offered some valuable goods, such as pearls, hunting dogs, and tin, it was economically peripheral. Its agricultural climate, especially in the north and west, was poor. Heavy rainfall, dense soils, and low temperatures made large-scale farming difficult, and many staple crops of the Roman world could not thrive. Olives, for instance, were impossible to grow, and vines could only survive in the more temperate parts of the south and east. The challenging terrain also impacted Roman efforts to expand political control. Despite attempts to conquer the entire island and even extend influence into Ireland, the Romans eventually drew firm boundaries. Hadrian's Wall, built between 122 and 138 AD, and later the Antonine Wall, 141 to 158 AD, marked the limits of Roman territory. These northern defenses excluded the more rugged parts of Scotland. After mid-2nd century, Rome abandoned the Antonine frontier and re-established Hadrian's Wall as the permanent northern border. Scotland, though influenced by Rome, was never fully conquered. Ireland, too, remained outside the empire. In that respect, the Roman conquest of the British Isles remained incomplete. By the middle of the 2nd century AD, Britain hosted around 10% of the entire Roman army, an estimated 40,000 to 55,000 soldiers. This strong military presence gave the province a distinctly martial character. However, troops were not evenly spread across the land. There were almost no military forces stationed in areas east of the River Severn or south of the River Humber. Instead, the primary concentrations were in the 3 major legionary bases at Caerleon, in South Wales, Chester, and York. Each of these fortresses could house about 5,500 legionaries, although only a portion of that number was typically present at any given time. In addition, a widespread network of auxiliary forts extended across Wales and the northern regions of Roman Britain, each garrisoned by 500 to 1,000 troops. After the Romans withdrew from southern Scotland, these auxiliary forces became concentrated along Hadrian's Wall, stretching from the Solway Firth to the Tyne estuary and throughout the surrounding hinterlands. In Wales and northern England, this military setup gave rise to a distinct frontier society. The economy in these areas revolved heavily around the presence of the Roman army, which the imperial administration paid and supplied regularly. Forts were often surrounded by civilian settlements known as vici, which developed from temporary markets into permanent towns with shops and stalls. These areas also included training grounds, small religious sites, and cemeteries marked with stone monuments. The military also held extensive pasture lands and exerted pressure on nearby communities through taxation and resource demands. They had authority over the native tribes, especially in the north and west. Yet, despite their reach, Roman garrisons often functioned as isolated centers of power, scattered among rural landscapes where life continued much as it had before the conquest. The countryside was dotted with small farming settlements, typically located in better drained lowlands, valley edges, and hillsides below 300 meters in elevation. Most of the local population lived in enclosed farmsteads with roundhouses and small fields that retained Iron Age characteristics. Apart from the occasional Roman pot or trinket, these communities showed little evidence of Roman cultural influence. Stone forts housing professional soldiers appeared almost alien amidst a landscape of traditional extended family farms. Urban centers were rare. Only places like Carlisle, Corbridge, and Carmarthen grew to modest size, and villas and temples were equally uncommon. The native elite left barely a trace in the archaeological record. Coin finds were scarce in rural zones, and there's little sign that locals invested in Roman-style architecture or lifestyles. This could be due, in part, to the economic pressures imposed by the army, which may have left little surplus for cultural adoption or display. Within this militarized upland region, the army stood as the dominant force. It brought with it its own cultural elements, religious customs, inscriptions, technical skills in building and metalwork, and a strong demand for goods like food, drink, and leather. Evidence of relatively widespread literacy has been found in places such as Vindolanda, just south of Hadrian's Wall, where writing tablets dating to around AD 100 have been discovered. Initially, many of the troops came from regions like Gaul, though units also included recruits from distant parts of the empire, and even from outside its borders. By the 3rd century, however, recruitment had become more localized. Many of the civilians who settled in the Vici to serve the military were also immigrants, including individuals like Barathes from Palmyra in Syria, who famously buried his British wife near the fort at South Shields. In contrast, the native population's role was often limited to supplying manual labor, army recruits, many of whom were posted abroad, enslaved workers, and sex workers. A key motivation behind the Roman conquest of Britain had been its natural resources. From early on, mining and extraction industries operated in upland zones. Tin was obtained from Cornwall, gold from Dolaucothi in Wales, and lead and silver from eastern and northeastern Wales, the Peak District, and the northern Pennines. Salt was extracted at Droitwich, in Cheshire, and along coastal areas. Coal deposits were worked in the East Midlands, while iron was mined in regions such as the Weald and the southeastern Midlands. However, none of these industries ever reached the scale or profitability of similar operations on the continent. These resources were often exploited through imperial monopolies or granted concessions, meaning that the financial benefits largely flowed back to the Roman state, rather than enriching local communities. Nonetheless, they likely helped to balance the substantial cost of maintaining such a large military presence in the province. The development of the British lowlands during the Roman period followed a different path than the uplands, although the influence of the Roman military was still quite strong. A comprehensive road network was built, with London emerging as the central hub. This city quickly became the main gateway for goods and military supplies entering Britain. Following the rebellion led by Boudica in AD 60 to 61, London, Londinium, was re-established and rose to prominence as the provincial capital. Before the Roman invasion, Britain had no true towns, only scattered coastal trading spots, and a number of oppida, large fortified settlements with clear social and political importance. Retired Roman soldiers were settled in 3 early colonial towns: Colchester, Gloucester, and Lincoln. Eventually, York and London were granted similar status due to their size and administrative importance. As Roman control pushed farther north and west, civil administration was handed over to new tribal districts known as civitates, each with its own urban center. These towns varied widely in size. London, the largest, spanned about 128 hectares, while most others were much smaller, averaging around 40 hectares. Some, like Carmarthen in the west, were as small as 6 hectares. Many of these ancient towns now lie buried beneath modern cities, obscuring their Roman layers. However, from the late 1960s onward, archaeological digs, especially in London, have provided deeper insight into the nature of Roman urban life in Britain. Unlike many provincial centers, London was not built upon a tribal heartland, but sat at the edge of several tribal territories. It grew quickly as a river port beside a mid-1st century military fort. And after its destruction in the Boudican uprising, it was rebuilt with a carefully laid-out plan featuring large public buildings. By the late 1st century, an auxiliary fort had been built at Cripplegate, and substantial new structures appeared across the city. Hadrian's visit in AD 122 stimulated a surge in construction. By the middle of the 2nd century, London had become a major city, with a population possibly reaching 50,000. Beneath Cannon Street Station lies what is believed to be the Governor's Palace, and the city boasted the largest forum north of the Alps, as well as several temples. Nowhere else in Britain featured such widespread use of imported, high-quality Roman stone. London's prosperity reflected both its role as a political center and its function as the primary port for trade with the continent, supported by extensive harbor infrastructure unearthed near London Bridge. Still, the city's fortunes declined in the later 2nd century, possibly due to reduced trade or outbreaks of disease. The population shrank, and construction slowed. While it never dwindled to the level of a mere administrative village, its influence certainly waned. The land-facing side of the city was enclosed with a massive stone wall, likely built by the usurper Clodius Albinus before his defeat in AD 197. Measuring roughly 3 kilometers long, 6 meters tall, and 2.5 meters thick, it was the largest stone structure in Roman Britain, aside from Hadrian's Wall. A river-facing extension was added in the later 3rd century, likely as protection from seaborne threats. Though London was the most impressive city in Roman Britain, better preserved archaeological remains can be found in towns that weren't built over in later centuries, such as Verulamium, St. Albans, Silchester in Hampshire, and Wroxeter in Shropshire. These towns, with their carefully planned street grids, featured central spaces for forums and basilicas that hosted trade and civic administration. Although early excavations focused on stone remains, most buildings in Roman towns were originally made of timber or wattle and daub. It wasn't until the 2nd century that stone civic buildings began to appear, accompanied by a gradual increase in stone-built townhouses. Compared to other provinces in the Western Empire, however, Roman Britain's urban development remained limited. Fewer towns existed, inscriptions were less common, and public amenities such as bathhouses, water systems, and entertainment venues were more modest. Colchester was home to the only known Roman circus in Britain, an amphitheater built on a grand scale and clearly tied to imperial interests. A major classical-style temple also stood there, marking it as unique. Elsewhere, the more modest Romano-Celtic temples typical of northern Gaul were more common, both in urban and rural settings. Bath stood out as an exception, where the local goddess Sulis was merged with the Roman deity Minerva, giving the city both religious and cultural significance. One of the unique features of Roman Britain was the early construction of town walls. Some towns had defensive earthworks faced with stone as early as the late 1st century, a level of fortification rarely seen in Gaul until much later. The reasons behind this early emphasis on defenses remain unclear. While it might be assumed these walls were for protection from external raiders or internal revolts, there may have been other motivations. Gates and walls could have served as symbols of civic pride, status, and competition, especially in areas near tribal boundaries. These structures may have had multiple roles, separating urban and rural zones, enforcing security, and expressing identity. Interestingly, the design of some Roman town walls in Britain bears a strong resemblance to the defenses of earlier oppida, suggesting a native influence in their construction. This desire for fortification was not limited to major towns. Many smaller settlements also built defensive walls. These small towns, typically under 20 hectares in size, served various functions. Some acted as rest stops and service centers for travelers. Others catered to local industries like salt, pottery, or mining. Certain towns, such as Catterick, were closely tied to military logistics. While difficult to distinguish archaeologically from large villages or villa complexes, small towns generally offered something extra, temples, markets, or public facilities that set them apart. In some cases, such as Bath, Gosbeck, or Elms Farm at Heybridge, Essex, towns grew around temple complexes that drew pilgrims, creating opportunities for hospitality services and the sale of local products. The presence of stone buildings varied widely in these settlements. Some, like Heybridge, remained largely timber-built. Cemeteries developed in an organized fashion along the major roads leading out of Roman towns. The diverse burial traditions of the late pre-Roman Iron Age gradually gave way to Roman-style cremation in the 1st and 2nd centuries, often accompanied by commemorative grave markers Later, by the end of the 2nd century and into the 3rd, burial practices shifted toward inhumation, frequently in newly established cemeteries. Coffins became widespread, and wealthier individuals were sometimes buried in elaborately decorated stone sarcophagi. Large excavations at sites like Bathgate in Cirencester, Poundbury in Dorchester, and Lankhills in Winchester, as well as cemeteries outside city walls at York and Leicester, have shown how systematically these areas were managed. The lack of grave reuse suggests that plots were well marked and maintained over time. Still, the burial grounds discovered so far likely served only a small segment of the population. Many rural communities continued using less archaeologically visible methods for disposing of their dead. Although Roman Britain never achieved the level of urbanization seen in other provinces, its main towns remained key centers for administration and culture. By around AD 100, London had become the provincial capital. A century later, the island was split into 2 provinces. London, as the capital of the larger and more southern Britannia Superior, was governed by a senator-ranked official, while York served as the center for Britannia Inferior to the north. In the 4th century, further divisions created a diocese composed of 4 or possibly 5 provinces. London, renamed Augusta in the mid-4th century, remained central as the seat of the diocesan government and a hub for taxation. Although its mint ceased production in the later Imperial period, London still played a vital administrative role. York maintained its importance in the north, while Cirencester and Lincoln were likely provincial capitals as well. Meanwhile, civitas centers handled local governance, justice, and tax collection, often keeping extensive records. It is widely assumed that Britain was predominantly Celtic-speaking before the Roman conquest, with regional dialects connected to the broader Gaulish linguistic world. These dialects eventually evolved into modern Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. Some scholars suggest a linguistic divide between lowland and highland areas, where lowland dialects were more heavily influenced by Latin. However, evidence for this distinction is limited. A competing theory argues that by the Roman period, Celtic was spoken only in the uplands, while lowland Britain had adopted a Germanic language due to contact with tribes like the Belgi from northern Gaul and Belgium. This theory has the advantage of explaining the relatively smooth transition to English in later centuries, yet it lacks solid evidence. The Belgae were likely Celtic speakers, not Germanic, and while their influence is seen in tribal names like the Paraisi in Yorkshire and the Belgi and Atrebates in the south, these names are not Germanic in origin. Furthermore, archaeological and place name evidence points to strong links between Celtic-speaking regions of France and southern Britain. Place names across Roman Britain, east and west alike, show consistent Romano-Celtic roots, and Celtic naming patterns continued into the 5th century, indicating the language remained in active use. There is little reason to believe Germanic languages had any significant foothold in Roman or pre-Roman Britain. The extent to which Latin spread among the British population remains uncertain. All surviving inscriptions and written records are in Latin, indicating its dominance in the military, government, commerce, and among the upper classes. Latin also appears in graffiti, particularly in towns, and features heavily in the many curse tablets found at temple sites such as Bath and Uli. These tablets, often written by ordinary people rather than trained scribes, show that both literacy and knowledge of Latin were more widespread than one might expect. Some even contain coded writing, using Greek letters or being folded and pierced with nails to keep the message hidden, implying concern over unauthorized readers. The discovery of writing tools in towns, temples, and villas supports the idea that literacy was relatively common. By the 4th century, Latin may have been gaining ground as a spoken language in the lowlands, much like what occurred in Gaul. Still, this shift may only reflect a portion of the population. Some tablets were clearly produced by people with limited literacy skills, suggesting many still struggled with the language. Roman-style education, seen among British clerics and writers in the post-Roman period, was probably confined to the elite. Meanwhile, changes in the phonology of British Celtic are evident in place names from southeast England that survived into the Anglo-Saxon period, indicating that Celtic languages continued to be spoken even alongside Latin. The use of personal names offers additional insight. Outside of London, traditional Roman naming conventions rarely appear. Most locals had Latinized versions of Celtic names and followed the peregrine custom of identifying themselves through parentage rather than Roman-style family names. In towns, immigrants, soldiers, and Roman officials likely dominated both socially and economically. These groups were responsible for many of the inscriptions that have survived. About 3,000 in total, a small number compared to other regions like North Africa, where over 60,000 inscriptions have been found. Despite the Roman overlay, the vast majority of Britain's population remained native and likely continued speaking British Celtic well into the final phase of Roman rule. When looking at the countryside during the Roman period, many scholars have highlighted the noticeable changes that took place. The introduction of Roman-style villas brought new forms of architecture, including features like underfloor heating systems and painted interior walls. Roads cut across the landscape, creating corridors along which new settlements appeared. Small towns developed, villages and farms expanded, rural markets emerged, and new crops, such as carrots, cabbage, and grapes, were introduced. Yet, despite these innovations, villas remained rare and were only found in a small fraction of settlements. Across much of the countryside, traditional patterns of land use from the late prehistoric period continued with little disruption. The Roman method of dividing land into rectilinear plots, widely used across other provinces, is not clearly evident in Britain, suggesting that the conquest did not bring large-scale land redistribution. Overall, the Roman impact on the countryside appears to have been one of gradual evolution rather than abrupt transformation. The roundhouse, a hallmark of Iron Age domestic life, remained the most common rural dwelling throughout much of the Roman occupation. The way land was worked changed very little for the majority of people. Since the 1950s, archaeological efforts have significantly increased the number of known settlements from both the Iron Age and Roman periods. This has led to upward revisions of population estimates. While early 20th century scholars suggested a population of around 1 million, later studies in the 1980s and 1990s proposed figures between 2 and 4 million. More recent estimates lean toward the lower end of that range, but most now agree that Roman Britain supported at least 2 million inhabitants. Though modest by modern standards, this population was similar to that recorded in 1086, and again around the year 1500. Roman Britain was therefore not only widely settled, but, in some regions, densely populated. Agriculture formed the backbone of the economy and was the primary source of wealth for landowners. It also formed the basis for imperial taxation. Villas, which are broadly defined as any rural building constructed in Roman style with stone or brick, serve as an indicator of elite success in the countryside. These varied greatly in size and design. Some were grand, boasting dozens of rooms and intricate mosaic floors, as seen at Chedworth, Woodchester, and Bignor. Others were more modest, little more than small farmhouses with a handful of rooms, such as those at Langton and Eton by Tarporley. Some belonged to Romanized Britons of high rank, while others were likely built for newcomers, officials, retired military officers, or traders. In rare instances, owners can be identified. For example, the villa at Lullingston is believed to have belonged to Publius Helvius Pertinax, who briefly ruled as emperor. Most villas, however, remain anonymous, and their inhabitants unknown. The distribution of villas throughout Britain shows how uneven rural development was under Roman rule. A recent inventory listed over 2,000 examples, though this total includes some buildings that might be better classified as village centers or religious sites. The geographic spread is telling. 5 counties alone, Cambridgeshire, Northamptonshire, Norfolk, Lincolnshire, and Wiltshire, account for over 40% of the total. More than half of the counties in modern Britain have fewer than 30 villas each, and a few areas, such as Cumbria, Gwynedd, Powys, and Lancashire, have only a single known site. The differences in villa density are too significant to be explained by environment or archaeology alone. They likely reflect varied social and economic conditions, differences in agricultural practices, and diverse relationships between local populations and Roman administration. Some areas may have been dominated by large imperial estates rather than villa-based landholding. In the 1st century, Roman goods of all kinds flowed into Britain, but over time the province began producing more for itself and relying less on imports. By the 2nd century, local industries had become more established, particularly pottery. These workshops, which used potters' wheels and purpose-built kilns, were typically modest in scale compared to continental centers. Still, some products like Oxford color-coated ware circulated widely across southern and eastern Britain. Other major pottery centers developed near Poole Harbour, in the New Forest, at Alice Holt, and in the Nene Valley. However, outside the lowland zones, pottery production was limited and often short-lived. By the 4th century, imports had sharply declined, with amphora used for transporting olive oil and fish sauce becoming increasingly rare. Many crafts and industries catered mainly to local demand. For instance, mosaic artists based in or near Cirencester during the 3rd century produced work for high-status homes in both urban and rural settings, but rarely ventured beyond nearby tribal territories. Around 2,000 mosaics have been uncovered in Britain, most displaying geometric designs. However, from the 3rd century onward, motifs inspired by classical myths and literature became more common, likely taken from popular design templates. Likewise, stonemasons and sculptors typically used local materials and worked on commissions for both public buildings and private residences. Events unfolding both within Britain and across the wider Roman Empire had a significant impact on how the empire managed its northernmost dioceses. In the east, the growing power of Persia during the 3rd century forced the empire to divert large numbers of troops and resources, which left the western provinces more vulnerable to barbarian attacks. Over time, this shift led to a rebalancing of power in northwestern Europe. Precious metals began to flow out of the empire, sometimes as diplomatic gifts, other times as payments to hired warriors, or even as plunder taken by raiders. Increasing pressure from barbarian groups, combined with economic instability caused by inflation and currency debasement, contributed to the weakening of imperial control. Governments, desperate for funds, repeatedly reduced the silver content in coinage, which eroded trust in the monetary system. These strains led to the collapse of central authority in the Western Empire, resulting in the emergence of breakaway regimes in Gaul that persisted until the reunification of the Roman state under Emperor Diocletian at the end of the 3rd century. Although the empire remained nominally unified, the 4th century saw a growing division between the administrations of the East and West. These broader changes had serious implications for communities beyond the Rhine frontier. In Germanic society, increasing numbers of men turned to warfare as a profession, either serving in Roman armies or joining the war bands of tribal leaders. Raiding became deeply ingrained in the social fabric of frontier societies. Behind these groups, the westward advance of the Huns set off a series of migrations, with 2 major waves entering Roman territory, the first in the 300s and 70s, and the second in the early 5th century. These movements included large groups of fighters capable of standing up to, and in some cases defeating, Roman forces. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 was a turning point, where the Eastern Emperor Valens was killed by Gothic troops. Even when peace was re-established, the empire had no choice but to allow semi-independent barbarian communities to settle within its borders. Although the Huns did not invade Roman territory directly until Attila's campaigns in the 450s, their earlier movements had already destabilized much of the Roman world and set in motion the slow collapse of the Western Empire. The Roman government found itself increasingly unable to gather the manpower, food, and financial resources needed to reinforce its military and defend its borders effectively. By the end of the 4th century, Britain had become increasingly isolated and hard to defend. As a distant province, Britain was particularly exposed to the consequences of imperial decline. Surrounded by sea, it was vulnerable to attacks from many directions and required a substantial military presence to guard both its northern frontier and coastal areas. Yet, by the mid-4th century, the number of soldiers stationed in Britain had dropped to perhaps a third or half of what it had been 2 centuries earlier. Troops were repeatedly withdrawn to deal with emergencies on the continent. The barracks at Chester were dismantled around the year 300, and the 2nd Legion left its base in South Wales before 400. By the end of the 4th century, only the 6th Legion remained in its original base at York. Auxiliary units also suffered severe reductions, in some cases shrinking to a fraction of their earlier strength. This decline in military manpower led to new strategies in dealing with neighboring peoples. The use of diplomatic gifts and subsidies became more common. One notable example is the large Roman silver hoard found at Traprainlaw in southern Scotland, possibly a result of efforts to placate local powers. The lack of Roman goods reaching northeastern Scotland, the core of Pictish territory, may indicate deliberate caution on the part of the empire, given the history of conflict with the Picts in the previous century. However, such neglect may have had the opposite effect, encouraging renewed raids along the eastern coast during times of Roman weakness. As frontier garrisons shrank and pay decreased, the surrounding civilian settlements, or vici, began to decline or were abandoned altogether. For landowners in Roman Britain, the reduced military burden may have temporarily eased economic pressures, allowing them to invest in villa construction or urban development in places like Carlisle, located near Hadrian's Wall. This shift may explain the late expansion and embellishment of many villas in Britain during the early 4th century, though the archaeological record is uneven and signs of prosperity fade after the middle of the century. In reality, some economic contraction had already begun in the 3rd century, and by the 4th, a general decline in various forms of activity was evident. Despite these challenges, Britain's defenses in the 4th century were still largely functional. Except for major disruptions such as the so-called barbarian conspiracy of 367, the province enjoyed relatively stable external conditions for much of the period. The evidence for the later decades is limited, but a late Roman administrative document, the Notitia Dignitatum, offers a partial record of the military structure in Britain during the 390 archaeological discoveries have helped confirm and expand upon this snapshot. In the south, military forces along the coast were commanded by the Count of the Saxon Shore. This officer oversaw remnants of the 2nd Legion, relocated to Richborough in Kent, and other coastal garrisons, 12 in total, though only 8 are listed in the Notitia. Altogether, these units likely numbered around 3,500 men. The fortifications under their control had been developed gradually over more than a century. Dover was the first to be fortified early in the 2nd century, followed by sites like Brancaster in Norfolk and Reculver on the eastern coast of Kent. During the later 3rd century, new forts were added to create a continuous defensive chain running from the Wash to the Solent. This network began to resemble a coordinated coastal defense system. These later coastal forts differed significantly from earlier Roman designs. Their layouts were often rectangular, trapezoidal, or even oval. They featured thick walls, projecting towers, deep ditches, and typically had only one main entrance, unlike the 4-gated forts of earlier centuries. While some of these forts may have seen civilian use over time, the strength of their walls indicates that they were built to resist military threats. Their poor connection to the inland road network suggests they were intended primarily as naval bases. Supporting this interpretation is the appearance in records of a fleet unit associated with Roman pevency, known as the Classis Anderetianorum, which was also active in Gaul. The Saxon Shore was one among several coastal defense commands operating along the Channel, working in coordination with similar installations in northern Gaul and Brittany. Earlier theories that the term Saxon referred to Saxon mercenaries stationed there have been largely dismissed. Instead, the name reflects the threat these forces were intended to counter: raiders from across the sea. For a time, these commands were successful in keeping Germanic incursions at bay, protecting the coastlines of southern Britain and the western provinces of the empire. In the north, defensive forces were still positioned along Hadrian's Wall and the roads leading south. These troops fell under the authority of the Duke of the Britons, whose headquarters was at York. Many forts along the wall, such as Housesteads, Vindolanda, and Burdiswald, remained occupied, though often with only small detachments of around 200 or 300 men, and sometimes fewer than 100. Unlike the south, there is little evidence of major new construction along the northern frontier in this period, though some forts were renovated. At Lancaster, for example, the Wary Wall was part of a fortified complex with corner towers in the style of the Saxon Shore. At Maryport and other locations, existing forts were upgraded with defensive towers. Intelligence gathering remained a part of the defensive strategy, as suggested by references to Roman scouts known as Ariani during the events of 367. A Roman military writer from the later period, Vegetius, may have had Britain in mind when describing green-painted coastal patrol ships designed to blend in with their surroundings. Along the North Sea coast, the fort at South Shields controlled access to the River Tyne, while Broughon Humber guarded the routes leading to York. Between the Tees and the Humber, a line of coastal signal stations was established, likely after 368, and was connected to a small fort that now lies beneath Scarborough's medieval castle. Though a naval base at Whitby has been proposed, no fort has yet been found, though some archaeological finds suggest maritime activity. This defensive system was probably created in response to raids by northern British or Pictish groups who may have bypassed Hadrian's Wall to launch attacks by sea. Similar defensive efforts were made in the west. A mid-3rd century fort was built at Cardiff, sharing characteristics with those of the Saxon shore. Around Anglesey, a combination of small forts and watchtowers was positioned to monitor the surrounding waters and deter raiders, especially those from Ireland. Excavations confirm that several forts in Wales remained in use into the later 4th century. Though these are not listed in surviving official documents, it seems likely that a smaller, distinct military command operated in Western Britain, aimed at defending against threats from Ireland, the Isle of Man, or Western Scotland. The units commanded by the military leaders at York and on the Saxon shore were mostly frontier troops known as limitani, a lower tier of Roman soldiers. Late Roman Britain likely had around 12,000 to 13,000 of these men. There is no firm evidence for a standing field army during the 360s, but a later Roman document records a Comes Britanniarum in charge of a mobile force made up of 3 infantry detachments and 6 cavalry units, possibly numbering between 3,000 and 6,000 men. These were comitatenses, a better-equipped and higher-paid group intended for more flexible deployment, likely active in Britain by the late 300s and 90s. By this time, the use of non-Roman troops had become widespread across the empire. Britain followed the same pattern. When Constantine began his campaign for imperial power from York in 306, he was accompanied by Crocus, a Germanic king, and his force of Alemanni. Another group of Alemanni is recorded as arriving in Britain in 372. Some historians believe that Irish settlement in western Wales during the sub-Roman period may have begun with the establishment of federated troops in the 4th century. While such foreign troops made up only a minority, the Germanic-sounding names of military commanders like Nectaridus and Fortified in 367 suggest the growing influence of these groups. It is possible that some or all of the mobile units in Britain by the end of the century consisted of barbarian soldiers. Despite the challenges, Britain's defenses held up relatively well until the late 4th century. Recruitment for frontier troops became increasingly local, with sons often following their fathers into service. The responsibility for supplying the army fell more heavily on the native population than in earlier times, when military needs were met through long-distance logistics. From the time of Diocletian, military provisioning became more localized, with taxes paid in kind and goods delivered directly to forts. British agricultural produce was also used to supply the armies along the Rhine during the later 4th century. Pottery continued to move northwards along trade routes, reaching Hadrian's Wall from southern Britain into the late 4th century. These shipments were likely small-scale, carried alongside official supplies. Other goods, especially military equipment, were increasingly produced in state-run factories. Britain had its own imperial weaving mill for army clothing, overseen by an official mentioned in administrative records. Some of the military gear used by British units was imported from factories on the continent, along with coinage from Roman mints. The gradual collapse of Britain's exchange-based economy can be traced through patterns of coin loss. By 2010, around 70,000 Roman coins had been recorded from the province, thanks in large part to metal detecting and reporting schemes. Though some areas remain underrepresented, the widespread presence of coins in the early 4th century indicates a vibrant economy. However, by the middle of the century, a clear decline in the number of coins found at key sites is visible. From the late 300s and 70s onward, coin loss is largely concentrated in a region stretching from East Anglia through the Thames Valley and into southern England. This pattern continued through the end of the century, apart from Richborough, where over 20,000 copper coins were deposited in the final decade. Roman Britain's towns experienced their peak during the 2nd century, when wealthy landowners invested heavily in urban residences and public life. After this period, towns began to contract. The decline is marked by a drop in new stone inscriptions and public sculptures, likely tied to a broader shift in power toward professional soldiers based along the frontiers. By the 4th century, many members of the provincial elite had abandoned their urban homes in favor of their country estates. Towns saw increasing neglect of key buildings. Public halls and marketplaces were often left to decay, demolished, or repurposed. At Silchester, for example, the town's central forum became a site for metalworking starting in the late 3rd century. The amphitheater may still have been used into the mid-4th century, but the dumping of rubbish on its banks after 350 shows that civic oversight was weakening. Many other public facilities, including theaters, aqueducts, bathhouses, and water systems, fell into disuse or were converted for new purposes. The large bath complex at Wroxeter is a well-documented example of this transition. Some of these changes may be connected to religious transformation. As Christianity gained ground, buildings associated with pagan rituals may have been deliberately abandoned. An imperial edict issued in 341 banned pagan temples in urban areas, and by the 390, pagan worship had been outlawed altogether. Nonetheless, the continued use of temple sites at places like Bath and Lydney suggests that enforcement of these laws was uneven, and that older religious practices persisted in some areas well into the late Roman period. Christianity remains difficult to trace through archaeology, even in the later 4th century, and it seems the Church in Britain may have operated with less prominence than in neighboring Gaul. Few British bishops or their delegates attended the church council held at Arles in 314, indicating they may have represented provincial interests rather than individual cities. One attendee, Restitutus, likely served as the Metropolitan Bishop of London and held the highest ecclesiastical authority in Britain at the time. Only a small number of urban churches have been confidently identified through excavations. At Silchester, a large structure near the Forum was once believed to be a church, but doubts have arisen about its original function. In Lincoln, the Church of St. Paul in the Bale, located within the Roman Forum, was first constructed in the late 4th century, expanded during the 5th century, and possibly survived into the later 6th century. Other known churches from the period, such as the one at Richborough, were relatively modest in scale. Evidence of Christianity also comes in the form of lead baptismal tanks, which have been found with some frequency, especially in East Anglia and Lincolnshire. Certain treasure hoards, including the one discovered at Water Newton, reflect Christian practices and suggest that some believers belonged to wealthy communities. The Christian-themed wall painting at Lullingston Villa and the Chai Row mosaic at Hinton, St. Mary, further point to elite patronage of the new faith. Still, in the latter example, the central figure's appearance seems to draw as much from imperial portraiture as from Christian iconography. It remains uncertain how widespread Christianity was among Britons by the year 400. The Bishop of Rouen, Victricius, writing in the 390s, appeared to assume that the story of St. Alban was familiar to his continental audience, yet few other native saints are well documented. Conversion likely progressed unevenly, taking stronger hold in urban centers, among military officers, government administrators, and members of the rural elite. The traditional notion that the Romans left Britain around 410 oversimplifies a much more complex reality. The people of Britain were still Roman in many respects, and the end of Roman Britain was not a single event, but a prolonged and gradual transformation that likely unfolded over 6 or 7 decades. One key episode was the so-called Barbarian Conspiracy of 367, during which Roman Britain suffered heavy raids from Saxons, Picts, and Scots. Although these incursions were swiftly dealt with, the nature of the reports is suspect. Ammianus Marcellinus, the main source for these events, was writing in support of Emperor Theodosius, whose father led the relief effort, and may have exaggerated the scale of the crisis. That only 2,000 troops were dispatched suggests the situation was more limited than portrayed. In 383, another general, Magnus Maximus, led a campaign beyond Hadrian's Wall and was declared emperor by his troops. He withdrew many British garrisons to support his claim to the throne. Though he achieved control over Gaul and gained recognition from some imperial rivals, his bid for power ended in defeat and death in 388 after his invasion of Italy failed. With his downfall, the Rhine frontier was left under the control of the Franks, and Britain was temporarily sidelined from imperial priorities. Though imperial authority was briefly restored, more troops were withdrawn in the 390 to address growing threats elsewhere. During his time in power, Maximus reactivated the mint in London, but it ceased operation after his death. From then on, Britain relied on imported coinage. Most of the money in circulation came from the imperial mints at Milan, Trier, and Lyon, but these too declined by the 390 and had nearly stopped producing by 413. The last major shipment of coin for the British garrisons arrived around 400. When payments ceased, unrest followed. A revolt erupted in 404, marking 100 years since Constantine's rise to power in York. In the years that followed, 3 different usurpers were declared emperor by the army in Britain. The final one, Constantine III, led his forces to Gaul around 407, hoping to secure control of the Western Empire. Although he initially gained ground, his movement fell apart under internal revolts, demands from barbarian groups, and resistance from loyalist forces. He was eventually captured and executed in Arles. Constantine's removal of troops from the coastal forts along the Saxon shore weakened Britain's maritime defenses, leading to renewed Saxon raids. Around 410, Gallic chroniclers recorded a particularly devastating attack. With no military command remaining and no mobile army stationed in the province, the south of Britain was left exposed. The Britons, with no aid from the continent, had to rely on their own strength to protect themselves. It is likely that most people still expected the empire to reassert its authority, as it had done during earlier crises. An early 6th century historian, Zosimus, claimed that the Saxon attacks pushed the Britons to abandon Roman law and take up arms to defend their cities. Elsewhere, Zosimus mentioned that Emperor Honorius had written letters to the British cities encouraging them to manage their own defense. However, this may be a misreading, as the passage probably referred to a region in southern Italy rather than Britain. The text was never revised and contains several known errors. Around the same time, the Romanized economy in Britain began to collapse. Building in stone effectively ceased, mosaic production stopped, and maintenance of existing structures declined. Trade slowed sharply, and local manufacturing faltered. According to the influential work of Simon Esmond Cleary, the economic model of late Roman Britain relied on cycles of exchange driven by taxation. Farmers would sell their produce for bronze coins, which could be exchanged for silver or gold to pay taxes and purchase manufactured goods. When coin shipments ended around 400, this system broke down. With the collapse of imperial governance around 410, the entire economic structure crumbled. Urban markets disappeared, industries failed, and villas, once centers of economic activity, fell into decay. Although the people of 5th century Britain continued to live on, they were no longer part of a Romanized society in any meaningful sense. The institutions, structures, and culture that had defined Roman Britain disintegrated rapidly and did not return. Across many Roman-era settlements in Britain, it becomes increasingly difficult to trace evidence of classically Roman lifestyles as the 5th century approaches. A recurring pattern appears in the archaeological record: elite houses abandoned or repurposed for agricultural use, only to be left empty not long afterward. In towns, population levels declined sharply in the later 4th century, and in many cases large sections within the city walls fell out of use entirely. However, the prevailing interpretations surrounding this decline warrant closer scrutiny. The assumption that the end of tax collection directly caused economic collapse may be too simplistic. Taxation generally suppresses economic growth rather than encouraging it, and the halt in coin production did not immediately remove the vast amount of coinage already circulating. The picture is more complex. Evidence points to a downturn in manufacturing and trade well before the official end of Roman administration. From the 360s onward, industrial output was already falling, and signs of vigorous economic life were becoming rare even before the administrative break with Rome. It is worth considering whether the early 5th century collapse archaeologists observe might have occurred regardless of whether Roman control had continued. The situation in Britain was not unique. Coin supplies from the empire ceased not only to Britain, but also to other northwestern provinces. In regions like the Rhineland, a similar reduction occurred, though economic contraction there was not as severe. The early 5th century crisis appears to have been a culmination of ongoing cultural and economic transformations, which deepened as political control receded. In this context, the absence of clear archaeological evidence for early 5th century occupation does not necessarily mean the land was uninhabited. We must adopt a more nuanced perspective on the question of continuity versus abandonment. Written records offer further insight. The life of St. Patrick, who likely lived as a child in early 5th century Britain, paints a picture of a society still deeply connected to Roman traditions. His father, Calpurnius, was a local landowner, a civic official, and a church deacon. His grandfather, Potitus, was a priest. All bore Latin names and lived in a place called Bonavem Taburniae, a name blending Latin and Celtic elements. Patrick was raised in a Christian household and received a classical Roman education until his capture by pirates at the age of 16. After 6 years enslaved in Ireland, he eventually returned and later became a missionary. His surviving writings, the Confession and Letter to Coroticus, show that Latin was still the main language of communication in the mid-5th century. Patrick assumed his readers had an even stronger grasp of the language than he did. When he referred to the sale of his noble status, it likely meant the sale of family land, suggesting that a functioning land market continued to exist in Britain at this time. Further evidence comes from the life of Saint Germanus, written by Constantius between 460 and 480. Germanus visited Britain twice, with the first trip dated to 429. He preached against Pelagianism, a heresy originated by the British teacher Pelagius, who had been active in Rome early in the 5th century. Germanus must have spoken in Latin and is said to have interacted with local elites, including a man named Elafius. The fact that Germanus baptized British soldiers under his command indicates that many common people were either still pagans or followers of heterodox beliefs. He also visited the shrine of Saint Alban, likely near Verulamium, and collected relics to take back to Gaul. This suggests that roads remained passable even 2 decades after imperial administration ended. That Germanus reportedly exiled Pelagian leaders on his second visit suggests a level of civil authority remained in place to carry out Roman legal sentences, although the historicity of this second visit is disputed. The later British writer Gildas also composed his works in Latin. His education appears to have been fully Roman in character, uninterrupted by the disruptions that marked Patrick's life. His writings reflect a high degree of classical learning, rivaling that of contemporary Gaul. He referred to Britons selling land to fund travel abroad for religious ordination, indicating the persistence of both a land economy and ecclesiastical networks well into the post-Roman period. Taken together, these texts show that aspects of Roman culture survived well beyond 410. In this light, sub-Roman Britain should be seen as a part of the wider Christian world of late antiquity, at least for several decades. A contrast emerges between the material evidence of cultural collapse and the literary signs of continuity. The endurance of elite practices suggests that the social structures supporting the landowning class persisted as well. One issue complicating interpretation is the difficulty of precise dating. Pottery, typically the most reliable indicator in Roman archaeology, had already declined from the 360s onward. Production levels dropped, innovation slowed, and many vessels from the 5th century resemble those made decades earlier. Despite this, some wheel-thrown pottery continued to be produced into the 5th century. At Cleetham in Lincolnshire, 4 urns made using Roman techniques were found in an Anglo-Saxon cemetery that dates to the second half of the century. Elsewhere, people returned to crafting vessels by hand using simpler methods. Some regions reverted to wooden or metal containers. Handmade ceramics were often distributed within small areas. For example, a jug and pedestal cup found in a 5th century grave at Baldock in Hertfordshire resemble other locally produced vessels near St. Albans. One pot found at nearby Purton, shaped in the style of early Anglian cremation urns, may indicate that a local potter was adapting designs for new, possibly Anglo-Saxon, customers. These handmade objects reflect an experimental phase, as craftspeople revived older techniques and perhaps tailored their work for new social groups. Additionally, many 4th century vessels continued to be used into the 5th century, with later burials still containing these older wares. Surviving metalwork from 5th century Britain is limited, but the reasons may include changes in how and where such objects were deposited. Many known examples come from Anglo-Saxon graves, including the quoit-style brooches that evolved from late Roman decorative styles. British Type I penannular brooches are found across a wider region, especially around the Severn estuary and in southeastern Scotland, but also in parts of Anglo-Saxon England, particularly Lindsey. In those areas, too, most finds come from burial contexts. Other objects include rings made from cut-down Roman bracelets, elaborately carved spindle whorls, and everyday items like hairpins, which are often hard to classify or date. Some exceptional sites offer a more detailed glimpse of continued activity. At Ickham in Kent, excavations revealed a series of watermills powered by diverted streams from the Little Stour estuary. These remained in use into the 5th century, as shown by finds of dress accessories, horse gear, glassware, and beads. Most of the pottery on site dates from after 370, and the watercourse serving the 4th mill was redug during the 5th century. Numerous bronze objects, apparently made at the site, point to a working production center that may have supplied both the nearby military base at Richborough and the town of Canterbury well into the post-Roman period. Urban archaeological deposits from this period present particular challenges. For a long time, excavators tended to remove everything above the well-preserved Roman stonework, meaning that much later evidence was discarded or overlooked. The upper layers of many sites are often the most disturbed by later activity, so research must concentrate on the towns that were not rebuilt during the medieval period. At Wroxeter, for example, the Roman baths were abandoned in the 4th century. Excavations uncovered a series of poorly dated timber-framed buildings that resembled a villa complex, but very few associated artifacts were found. This phase may relate less to 5th century activity and more to later stone gathering by Anglo-Saxons for church construction. As a result, the true extent of post-Roman occupation at the site remains uncertain. In Canterbury, wooden structures were constructed within the ruins of earlier stone buildings and may have stood into the 420s or later. However, by this point, control over the urban landscape had deteriorated. Human and animal burials were made in open pits on Stour Street, and the city appears to have been largely abandoned. At Verulamium, investigations have focused on one block where a building from around 380 was altered to include corn dryers in the early 5th century. This structure was eventually replaced by a barn, which in turn was disrupted by a carefully constructed water pipeline laid after 450. While some aspects of this sequence have been debated, a coin found sealed beneath the mosaic floor supports the original dating. Outside the city walls, devotion to St. Alban continued to develop, though no burial church has yet been located. Scattered finds indicate ongoing activity into the 5th and 6th centuries, and later writers believed worship had persisted uninterrupted. At Silchester, the upper layers of the town have been heavily disturbed by later agriculture. Nonetheless, finds such as imported pottery, a glass bead, and an Ogham inscription point to continued occupation into the later 5th century. The town seems to have been deliberately closed down, with wells intentionally sealed. Yet, even here, by around 450, the settlement no longer functioned as a Roman-style town. These cases do suggest a gradual decline in urban life, but not an abrupt or total collapse. In fact, there are signs of continued organization and oversight of space even into the 5th century. Other towns also show evidence of survival. Coin finds from the 400s and 430s at places like Caerwent and Dunstable suggest they remained occupied. Post-Roman activity is also apparent at Bath, Chester, and likely at Whitchurch. Significantly, there is no archaeological evidence of violent destruction by invading groups, despite later claims of such events. The frequent appearance of dark soil layers covering Roman deposits, often called black earth, has been interpreted in various ways, such as collapsed buildings, agricultural use, or even as waste accumulation from people and animals sheltering within city walls. Whatever the cause, it implies continued, if diminished, use of these areas after the end of formal civic administration. 5th century towns may not have resembled their earlier selves, but they were not entirely deserted. Further insight into this transitional period comes from burial evidence. In comparison to Anglo-Saxon cemeteries, British burial grounds from this era have received less study, where graves show a wide variety of orientations and include numerous grave goods. Pre-Christian traditions likely remained strong. While Christian burial did not forbid grave goods, they generally decreased with the spread of Christianity, and consistent west-east alignments were favored. At the cemetery in Lank Hills, Winchester, most graves followed this Christian alignment. Few graves were reused, suggesting a well-managed cemetery. Many of the dead wore footwear, indicated by nail patterns, and while some were buried with objects, these were mostly belts, knives, and brooches, hinting at a military or administrative segment of the population. This appears to have been a largely Christian burial ground. Elsewhere, pagan sites continued to serve as burial locations. At Baldock, graves with grave goods existed alongside multiple phases of road repair, supporting the idea of long-term occupation into the 6th century. A cemetery outside the Roman town at Billingford also remained in use. Excavations in Southwark, London, uncovered a temple complex that began in the 2nd century and was still active in the 4th. Its associated cemetery contained various types of burials and goods, pointing to a mixture of beliefs and practices well into the 5th century. That such activity persisted near the heart of Roman administration suggests that non-Christian religion remained widespread. In Gaul, where Christianization progressed earlier, churches built beyond town walls became focal points for worship and ritual. These sites often emerged within or near cemeteries. St. Martin's tomb outside Tours quickly became a shrine, and Germanus was also buried outside the town of Auxerre. A similar pattern may have occurred at St. Albans, though the church has yet to be identified. In Britain, such evidence is scarcer. One promising site is St. Martin in the Fields in Westminster, which shows signs of elite burials continuing into the 5th century, alongside evidence of a nearby tile kiln. This area continued to be used into the early Saxon period and may represent a successful church site linked to late Roman London. Another important source of information for the late 4th and early 5th centuries comes from hordes of metalwork. Some, such as the Thetford hoard and the Mildenhall treasure, contain items of exceptional craftsmanship in precious metals and were discovered in East Anglia. The Thetford hoard included silver tableware and gold jewelry of very high quality, showing that luxury goods still circulated and were appreciated. Not all hoards consisted of valuables. The Draper's Garden hoard from London, for instance, contained vessels made of bronze, pewter, and iron. Britain has produced a greater number of metal hoards from this period than most other Western provinces, despite facing similar invasions. This suggests that hoarding was not solely driven by fear of looting, but may have had ritual motivations. The Draper's Garden hoard, for instance, appears to have been placed during the sealing of a well, perhaps as part of a religious act. Such deposits may point to the persistence of traditional religious customs. Notably, many of the richest hoards have been found in East Anglia, a pattern that does not match the earlier distribution of elite features like mosaics or villas. The most significant hoard of Roman-era valuables discovered in Britain was unearthed in 1992 near Hoxton in Suffolk. This collection contained 580 gold coins and about 15,000 silver coins, along with nearly 30 pieces of gold jewelry and over 120 silver vessels. These items were buried in a wooden box, with the coins poured in after the valuables were arranged. Most of the coins date from 395 to 402, with a few minted slightly later, placing the deposition around 407 or 408. This horde is one of over 70 recorded from this general period, a third of which were deposited after 407, but before the mid-5th century. Whether the Hoxne horde was intended as a ritual offering remains uncertain, but the possibility exists. An intriguing detail is the presence of 428 imitation silver coins. Some were forgeries, but most were precise replicas, created with the correct weight and silver content. These likely served official functions and suggest local authorities were issuing their own coinage. Most imitated 4th century designs, although some were struck after official coin imports had stopped. Nearly all of the coins had been clipped, a distinctly British practice where small pieces of silver were shaved off while keeping the image intact. Even the 8 coins from 407 had been clipped, showing that coin use and modification continued after that date. Some coins were clipped so heavily they had lost up to 2/3 of their original weight, indicating the practice was long-lived. This evidence suggests that coin management persisted in Britain even after imperial authority had withdrawn. The clipped silver may have been melted down to produce ingots, which are found in hordes from this period in places like Coleraine and Vindolanda. These ingots would have been used for diplomacy, ransom, or military payments. Their value depended on weight and silver quality. Meanwhile, the clipped coins continued to circulate, even as their silver content diminished. Although imperial taxes were collected in gold, some gold coins still entered Britain and remained in circulation. Without the pressure of imperial taxation, however, these may have been valued more as bullion or collectible objects. Over time, gold coins were sometimes turned into pendants and buried in early Anglo-Saxon graves. Following the collapse of Constantine's rule, the continued presence of silver coins suggests that some form of local authority remained in Britain, resisting the notion of a swift and total breakdown of Roman governance. The practice of clipping silver coins, which involved shaving small amounts of metal while preserving the coin's recognizability, seems to have persisted for some time. However, a hoard found at Patching in Sussex, dating to around 470, included unclipped coins, indicating that this practice had ended by then. Even so, the collapse of the broader monetary system likely occurred well before that point, along with any remaining sense of centralized control across Britain. The end of Roman Britain was not marked by a sudden or complete collapse. For many years, people likely expected the empire to reassert itself, as it had in past crises. This belief may have sustained provisional local governments that engaged in diplomacy with both Gaul and various barbarian groups. This view is supported by historical events, such as the British request that brought Bishop Germanus to the island in 429, and by Gildas's account of a British plea for assistance sent to the Roman general Aetius in the mid-5th century. Gildas remains the sole contemporary source for this transitional period, and although his text is notoriously challenging, it offers valuable insight. Writing from a British perspective, he lamented the suffering of his people, describing attacks on Britons collectively, not just isolated regions. He portrayed the response as a coordinated effort led by a ruler advised by foolish counselors, referencing biblical imagery to frame the situation. Gildas referred to surviving officials and watchmen, terms that reflect Roman governmental language, and similar titles appear on inscribed stones from Western Britain of the same era. While Gildas acknowledged ongoing civil strife and the rise of local warlords, he also indicated that the full transformation from Roman administration to fragmented petty kingdoms happened relatively late. The pivotal change came with internal conflict between native Britons and the Saxon mercenaries they had hired. Thus, the shift from Roman to post-Roman Britain appears more gradual, with some continuity in governance persisting into the mid-5th century. It is likely that power gradually shifted from diocesan-level administration to more localized provincial and tribal leadership after 410, particularly with the collapse of Roman military organization. Archaeological findings, such as different styles of sword belt fittings, suggest the emergence of regional centers of power, where distinct styles may have reflected the identities of local elites or militias. Monumental earthworks, known as dikes, also provide clues about this period. Though dating them is often difficult, those that intersect with Roman remains must post-date the empire. These structures vary in size, with some among the largest man-made features in Europe before modern times. Though many have been studied and named, such as Offa's Dyke and Watt's Dyke, others remain poorly understood. Some dikes appear to have been prehistoric constructions reused and reinforced during or after the Roman withdrawal. The distribution of dikes is uneven across Britain. They are missing from areas such as Wales, Scotland's Highlands, northwestern and central England, and much of the southeast. In some regions, they appear in parallel groups or face each other, raising questions about their function and purpose. Where archaeological evidence is strong, historians can confidently date some major dikes to the Anglo-Saxon period. For instance, Offa's Dyke and Watt's Dyke were likely built in this era, as were several in Cambridgeshire. In other areas, like Norfolk or Cornwall, the situation is murkier. There, dikes may be refurbished prehistoric structures, often named after giants or the devil, names that hint more at folklore than clear historical records. Anglo-Saxon charters mention some dikes, but we cannot be sure how old they were when those documents were written. These structures range in scale from short barriers barely 100 meters long to immense works like Offa's Dyke, which stretches over 100 kilometers. Typically, they consist of a single ditch and bank, with no defensive structures like palisades or forts. Debate continues over the purpose of these dikes. Earlier scholars often viewed them as military defenses built either by Britons or Saxons during periods of invasion and resistance. However, the simplicity and vulnerability of many dikes suggest they were not robust defensive lines. Some modern interpretations propose that dikes functioned more as territorial markers or symbols of authority rather than military barriers. In the 20th century, some historians suggested that large dikes served ceremonial or symbolic roles, helping kings to consolidate diverse communities under their rule. The idea that Britain's early medieval landscape was divided strictly along ethnic lines, Britons on one side, Saxons on the other, has since been discarded. It is now more common to view these divisions as cultural rather than purely racial. While Offa's Dyke may reflect a royal statement of power, most other dikes are not associated with known kings and go unmentioned in surviving Anglo-Saxon literature, which otherwise celebrates royal deeds. One interpretation of the linear dikes scattered across post-Roman Britain is that they served as deterrents against constant raiding. Especially in the case of shorter dikes, these structures may have been intended to disrupt fast-moving raids rather than serve as major defensive lines. Many of them intersect important routes that raiders could have exploited, and their positioning, often not directly on known political boundaries, suggests they might have functioned as fallback points where local defenders could gather once an incursion had already occurred. Though their precise functions likely varied over time and place, What they consistently show is that communities were capable of organizing large-scale labor projects. These efforts imply the existence of functioning local hierarchies. In fact, some comments by Gildas regarding the Antonine Wall may hint that similar dikes were still being constructed around the year 500. During this turbulent period, there is also evidence that many Iron Age hill forts, particularly in western Britain, were reoccupied. Some of the most significant examples are in the southwest, such as South Cadbury, where substantial inner ramparts were rebuilt and large new buildings erected. There are also signs of renewed occupation further east, including at Yarborough Camp near Lincoln and possibly Yarburg near Louth, where late Roman artifacts have been found. The reuse of these fortified sites suggests that people were retreating from vulnerable settlements and seeking security behind the reconstructed defenses of ancient strongholds. Some of these places had continued to hold religious significance, which may have enhanced their symbolic and protective appeal. This shift in settlement patterns reflects not only growing insecurity, but also a localized approach to survival, separate from broader governmental structures. The fundamental issue throughout the 5th century was security. When Constantine III took the British field army and much of the Saxon shore defense force to the continent, it left Britain with a lopsided defense system. The north remained relatively fortified, while the more prosperous south became vulnerable to sea-borne raiders. Archaeological findings indicate that several forts in the north continued to be used during this time. At Burdiswald in Cumbria, one of the granaries was torn down and replaced with a large wooden hall. In Binchester, the commandant's house underwent expansion in the late 4th century, later became a site for butchery and metalwork, and was eventually used for burials. At Vindolanda, a church was built on the site of the commanding officer's residence, and inscriptions indicate that literacy and Christianity endured. Housesteads remained occupied, and at Piercebridge, the bathhouse showed signs of continued use, while new wooden buildings went up in Catterick after 400. Meanwhile, in the lowland regions of Britain, civilian elites dominated the local power structures, but they no longer enjoyed the military protection that Rome once provided. Beneath them, the population was largely provincial and localized, with fewer direct ties to Roman norms than their counterparts on the continent. Pagan beliefs remained widespread, even in areas like the outskirts of London. The British Celtic language endured despite centuries of Latin influence. Roman identity, once deeply rooted in towns and elite households, was in decline. With Roman culture deteriorating and Britain positioned at the empire's edge, exposed to northern land invasions and maritime threats, security collapsed. Even Bishop Germanus reportedly had to lead armed forces against raiders. This insecurity was the central challenge for Britain's leadership, as reflected in Gildas's lamentation over the island's decline. In their desperation, British leaders looked once more to the empire for help. When no aid came, they did what Roman officials had often done in times of crisis. They hired barbarian troops to defend their territory. Gildas even uses familiar Roman administrative terms to describe this process, including the provisioning of mercenaries through customary systems of hospitality and supply. These actions suggest that a Roman-style governing class still operated in Britain well into the mid-5th century, even as the society beneath them grew less Roman with each passing decade. For a time, this hybrid arrangement seemed viable. However, the Roman system continued to unravel across all fronts. Coinage failed, monumental construction stopped, manufacturing and trade declined, and piracy surged. Ultimately, the turning point came when the mercenary Saxons, initially hired to defend Britain, turned against their employers. With no imperial backup, the local leadership was unable to contain the revolt. Though British elites retained influence in some areas, especially in the lowlands where they coexisted with new Saxon settlements, the broader Roman system had collapsed. In his work Agricola, written near the end of the 1st century, the Roman historian Tacitus speculated about the origins of Britain's inhabitants. He suggested that the people of southern Wales resembled the Spanish so closely that they might have descended from settlers from the Iberian Peninsula. Similarly, he proposed that the Caledonians of Scotland could trace their roots to Germanic peoples, while the lowland Britons might have come from Gaul. Ultimately, though, Tacitus dismissed such questions as unworthy of serious Roman interest, remarking that the ancestry of Britain's inhabitants, whether native or immigrant, was unknowable and irrelevant, since they were barbarians in Roman eyes. Today, many of the same questions are being asked again, but this time about the period just after the end of Roman rule in Britain, roughly between 430 and 570. This was a time of sweeping cultural transformation, especially in the south and east of the island. During this period, Latin and Brittonic languages disappeared from lowland Britain, replaced by Old English. Christianity lost ground to Germanic paganism, and the archaeological record reveals significant shifts in material culture and architecture. The society that emerges in the archaeological evidence looks entirely different from its Roman predecessor. This raises fundamental questions. What exactly changed, and why? Was there a mass migration from across the North Sea that effectively replaced the existing population? Or did the local people gradually adopt the language and customs of a small group of newcomers, becoming English in the process? And why was this transformation so much more complete in Britain than in other parts of the former Western Roman Empire, such as France, Italy, or Spain? These regions also experienced Germanic migrations, but retained their Latin languages and Christian traditions. To fully understand what happened in southeastern Britain, one must draw upon historical texts, archaeology, genetics, and linguistics. A comparative approach is also vital, especially in contrasting Britain's path with developments on the European mainland. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, historians widely accepted the idea of a large-scale Germanic invasion in the 5th century as the foundational moment of English history. In 1892, John Richard Green famously declared that the landing of the warrior Hengist and his followers at Ebbsfleet marked the true beginning of England's story. This event, in the eyes of Victorian writers, was sacred ground, the moment when English history first took shape. Support for this theory came from place name research and burial evidence, but it mostly relied on written sources like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Bede's historical writings. The Chronicle, written in the late 9th century, offered a simple timeline that Victorian historians treated as fact. It described the arrivals of various leaders: Hengist in Kent, 449, Ella in Sussex, 477, and Cerdic in Wessex, 495, each landing with only a few ships. These tales likely evolved from earlier stories, particularly Gildas's account of the arrival of 3 Saxon ships, an event later repeated by Bede and transformed into origin legends for several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. A close look at names in these early records reveals how unreliable they are for the 5th century. For instance, the Chronicle describes the arrival of Cerdic and his son Cynric, both of whom bore Celtic names, followed by a man named Port, possibly connected to the Latin name of Portchester, and his sons, one of whom was named Megla, another Celtic name. This blending of traditions is improbable. In reality, the group later known as the West Saxons likely began as the Govissa, originating in the Upper Thames region and only later shifting their focus southward under pressure from rivals like the Mercians. Bede, writing in the early 8th century, was closer in time than the chronicle's author, but still far removed from the actual events. His interest in the origins of the English shaped the way later generations understood the past. In his writings, Bede considered the arrival of the English, the Adventus Saxonum, as the beginning of English history. He occasionally used this event as a point of reference, dating events such as the papacy of Gregory the Great to roughly 150 years after the English came to Britain. In an early chronicle from 703, Bede listed just 2 key events: the arrival of the Angles and their conversion to Christianity. By the time of his more developed Greater Chronicle around 725, Bede expanded on this narrative. He described how 3 ships brought the first Anglo-Saxons to Britain. When their expedition succeeded, word spread back home, prompting a larger group to set sail. This force, combining with the original arrivals, first defeated their enemies, the Picts and Scots, and then turned on their former allies, the Britons. They reportedly conquered most of the island by force, using the excuse that the Britons had failed to pay them adequately for their military service. At this stage, Bede had likely discovered Gildas's earlier account, though he struggled with Gildas's lack of dates. He used Gildas as a source again in his next comment, describing how the Roman Ambrosius Aurelianus, whose noble parents had been killed by the Saxons, rallied the Britons and led them to victory. After this, Bede said, victories shifted back and forth until the stronger Saxons eventually gained lasting control of the island. Although Bede gave the moral upper hand to the Roman Ambrosius, he still portrayed the Saxons as the ultimate conquerors. His account, despite its literary caution, reinforced the idea of a near-total Saxon conquest of Britain, a narrative that deeply influenced all later English history writing. A revised version of the same story appears in the first book of Bede's ecclesiastical history, completed in 731. This time, Bede once again followed the outline laid out by Gildas, but with far greater elaboration, framing the narrative as a moral lesson about the downfall of a corrupt and weakened British people after the Roman army had withdrawn. In chapter 12, he describes the Britons suffering under harsh raids from the Irish and the Picts. Their desperate appeal for help from the Roman general Aetius in Gaul failed, and by chapter 14, they resolved to summon Saxon forces from overseas. Gildas had condemned this decision as foolish and short-sighted, but Bede reinterpreted it as divinely ordained, a punishment from God meant to fall upon a sinful people. In chapter 15, he turned his attention to the military strength and qualities of the incoming English. In the middle of the chapter, Bede diverged from Gildas and inserted his own description of what he framed as the Anglo-Saxon settlement. He wrote that the English came from 3 powerful Germanic tribes, the Saxons, the Angles, and the Jutes. According to this account, the people of Kent, the Isle of Wight, and parts of the West Saxon kingdom descended from the Jutes. The East, South, and West Saxons originated from the territory now known as Old Saxony. Meanwhile, the Angles came from a region called Angulus, which was located between the Saxons and the Jutes, and, by Bede's time, had reportedly remained uninhabited since the migration. From there came the East Angles, Middle Angles, Mercians, and Northumbrians. Bede stated that the first leaders of this migration were 2 brothers named Hengest and Horsa. Horsa, according to Bede, was later killed in battle with the Britons, and a monument in eastern Kent supposedly marked his burial. the brothers were said to descend from a genealogical line tracing back through Withdrawal, Witta, and Wecta to the god Woden, a lineage claimed by several royal dynasties. This passage, inserted late in the composition of the ecclesiastical history, reflects the political landscape of the early 8th century, particularly in the region of Canterbury. It opens and closes with references to Kent, and the genealogy is closely tied to the Jutish origin myths. Names like Withdrawal and Wecta seem to draw from both native and Latin references to the Isle of Wight. Rather than providing an accurate historical record, the account reads more like an early 8th century reinterpretation of English origins, shaped by contemporary political concerns and regional identities. After this section, Bede returned to the framework provided by Gildas, expanding on the arrival of a larger wave of migrants and describing them as an overwhelming force. He recounted the leadership of Ambrosius Aurelianus, who rallied the Britons and led them to victory, culminating in the siege of Mount Baden, where the Britons inflicted a heavy defeat on their enemies. The following chapters in Bede's narrative relied heavily on the life of Germanus, a hagiography written in Gaul between 460 and 480. From this source, Bede recounted Germanus's 2 visits to Britain and his spiritual triumphs, including the famous Alleluia victory over Saxons and Picts. Yet even here, Bede's focus remained on the moral failings of the Britons. Just before introducing the story of Augustine's mission to convert the English, Bede closed this section by once more returning to Gildas. He described a Britain plagued by internal divisions, the continued decay of its towns, and the collapse of moral and spiritual values. In Bede's view, one of the Britons' greatest failures was their refusal to share the Christian message with the English. But he insisted that God had rectified this by sending more worthy messengers in the form of later missionaries, thus setting the stage for Augustine's arrival. The differences between how the Anglo-Saxon settlement was portrayed in Bede's Greater Chronicle of 725 and the ecclesiastical history of 731 reveal changes in Bede's goals as a writer. In the earlier work, he was crafting a universal Christian chronology that integrated the English into a divine plan of history. By 731, however, he was addressing a broader audience and presenting a moral warning. The Britons had lost their land because of their sins and disobedience, and the English had taken their place by divine design. For Bede's Northumbrian contemporaries, whose power had declined since 685, this served as a cautionary tale. To support this narrative, Bede emphasized a clear division between the Britons and the English, each with their own distinct relationship to God. A large-scale migration was essential to this story, and so his later version leaned heavily on the idea of a widespread and decisive settlement. Despite the vividness of Bede's later narrative, it is the furthest removed from his original sources and has no independent historical basis. When we return to those sources, it is striking how limited they actually are. Gildas remained the primary reference, but even his account was shaped differently in Bede's various writings. The life of Germanus mentions the Saxons only briefly. Gildas's work is valuable because it comes from a time closer to the events it describes, but it is difficult to use with confidence due to its vagueness chronology, unclear geography, limited cast of characters, and its uncertain conclusions about the war between the Britons and the Saxons. Nonetheless, Gildas's feelings about the Saxons are unmistakable. He viewed them with intense hostility, describing them as ruthless warriors, enslavers, and raiders who posed a real threat during his lifetime. His account may be flawed, but it remains one of the few surviving voices from this transitional period in British history. Two important texts from this period associated with Britain are the Confession and Letter of St. Patrick, most likely written in Ireland during the mid-5th century. Though they do not mention the Saxons, they do offer a glimpse into a turbulent world shaped by slave raiding and violence across both sides of the Irish Sea. Around the same time, the Gallic bishop Sidonius Apollinaris wrote a letter to a man named Nemetius, who served the Visigoths in Aquitaine. In this letter, Sidonius referred to Saxon pirates, accusing them of drowning a tenth of their captives before setting sail from the continent. These pirates may have originated from Britain, transporting enslaved people back to their homelands. Another key reference appears in the Gallic Chronicle of 452. This document briefly states that in the year 441, the provinces of Britain had fallen into Saxon control across a wide area due to various disasters. Written in southern Gaul by a cleric unfamiliar with Britain, the account's accuracy is difficult to verify. Still, it likely dates to the early 450s, making it one of the closest contemporary remarks on events in post-Roman Britain. While the chronicle does not describe the specific events that led to this collapse, it implies that significant upheaval had taken place. The suggestion that Britain had already been widely ceded to the Saxons by 441 marks a stark contrast to other accounts, such as that of Constantius, who described Britain as prosperous and secure following Germanus's visit. Archaeological evidence from regions like the Middle Thames Valley and Somerset indicates that British-style burials persisted into the early 6th century. At sites like Poundbury, near Dorchester, settlements possibly linked to monastic life emerged around long-used Romano-British cemeteries. Some urban centers also show signs of continued occupation into the mid or even late 5th century. Nevertheless, by the 430s, it becomes increasingly difficult for archaeologists to identify material culture that can be confidently called British. In regions like eastern England and the Upper Thames Valley, new burial customs and distinct artifacts began to appear, reflecting changes in architecture and personal adornment. The term Anglo-Saxon is used to describe this emerging archaeological culture, although it refers to lifestyle and customs rather than ethnicity. The study of Anglo-Saxon archaeology has a long tradition. As early as the 17th century, people noted plowed-up graves, and systematic excavations began in the late 18th century. Researchers such as Brian Fawcett and James Douglas explored barrow cemeteries in Kent, with Douglas among the first to correctly identify these finds as belonging to the Anglo-Saxon period, rather than Roman or British. By the mid-19th century, Douglas's interpretation had become dominant. Archaeologists began matching grave goods to historical accounts of the Anglo-Saxon migration. For example, saucer brooches were linked to Saxon territories, while cruciform brooches were seen as evidence of Anglian presence. Comparisons between artifacts from England and those from areas in northwest Germany and southern Denmark supported the idea of a connection between the two regions. However, dating these finds has always posed a challenge. To overcome this, archaeologists developed typologies, relative dating systems based on stylistic changes in objects. These typologies were anchored by grave sites on the continent, where coins allow for more precise dating. Even so, the reliability of later chronological phases is limited due to the overlapping styles and the varying ages of items when buried, some newly crafted, others already decades old. In the early days of the discipline, Archaeologists largely followed the historical narrative provided by scholars, interpreting their discoveries as confirmation of the so-called English settlement. This migrationist approach is well illustrated by J.N.L. Myers, who, in a 1986 update of his earlier work, argued that the distribution of Anglo-Saxon cemeteries and settlements closely reflected both the landscape and earlier Roman infrastructure. Yet from the 1970s onward, a new generation of archaeologists began to move away from historical dependence, focusing instead on broader patterns of social and economic change. This processual approach emphasized systems and structures over migration, treating the early Anglo-Saxon period more like a prehistoric society. It prioritized studies of social hierarchy, trade, and resource access, downplaying the idea of invasions. However, this new approach also came under criticism for being too rigid and for ignoring cultural complexity. In response, later scholars introduced more nuanced perspectives, drawing on cultural theory from other disciplines. They embraced the diversity found in the archaeological record and benefited from the rapid technological advancements in data analysis. Modern computing power allows researchers to study entire site assemblages rather than relying solely on the classification of individual objects. This has led to a more refined understanding of early medieval material culture. Debates about the precise beginning of Anglo-Saxon settlement have long persisted. In the mid-20th century, Myers proposed that a type of pottery he named Romano-Saxon was produced by native British potters for Saxon soldiers stationed at coastal forts. If true, this would push the settlement's beginnings back into the 4th century. But this theory lost support when it was discovered that this pottery shared the same deposition patterns as other local styles, indicating it had the same group of users. Attention then turned to late Roman-style military belt fittings found in graves in Britain and on the continent, particularly in Western Germany and the Rhineland. These belts were thought to be associated with barbarian soldiers in Roman service. In Britain, some fittings were produced locally, while others came from abroad. They have been found in areas with known late Roman presence, such as Richborough in Kent and Dorchester-on-Thames. However, many of these burials may still be Roman rather than Germanic. More convincing evidence of incoming settlers comes from early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries, such as those at Mucking in Essex, where distinctively Anglo-Saxon artifacts appear alongside such military items. Another indicator of cultural transition is the development of the quoit brooch style, a 5th-century metalwork design based on Roman military belt gear. British craftsmen transformed this into a unique chip-carved brooch style. Most examples have been found south of the Thames, though some have also turned up in Gaul. Despite being relatively few in number, many were discovered in Anglo-Saxon graves, suggesting that they were adopted by Germanic mercenaries. The earliest examples resemble Roman forms, but over time, the style evolved into something more distinctly Germanic, reflecting a shift in usage and cultural influence. These brooches, probably used to fasten cloaks, eventually replaced the Roman crossbow-type fittings and were later repurposed as female dress accessories, long after their original military function had been forgotten. Anglo-Saxon cemeteries are notable for two contrasting burial methods: inhumation, where the entire body is laid to rest in a grave, and cremation, where the body is burned and the ashes are usually placed in a ceramic urn. Cremation had long been a common practice in northern Germany during the 4th century, though inhumation with grave goods was also practiced both within and beyond the Roman frontiers. There appears to be a strong association between cremation and areas traditionally linked to Anglian groups, while inhumation tends to dominate in regions associated with the Saxons. However, the discovery of cremation graves outside traditional Anglian zones has blurred this pattern over time. These different burial customs reflect varying attitudes toward death and mourning, and may point to distinct forms of social organization. Since cremation was virtually absent in late Roman Britain, its 5th century resurgence likely signals the arrival of new populations. Anglo-Saxon inhumations also differ markedly from Romano-British ones, the former often including weapons, jewelry, or other objects, while the latter rarely had more than small personal items or coffin fittings. Although there are instances where cemeteries continued to be used across the transition from Roman to Anglo-Saxon rule, such as those at Wasperton Sandy and Frilford, this was uncommon, as most Roman-era cemeteries were linked to towns that declined in the post-Roman period, leading to their eventual abandonment. To date, archaeologists have identified roughly 25,000 early Anglo-Saxon graves in about 1,100 cemetery sites, and discoveries continue. The total exceeds the number of known Romano-British graves, suggesting that population size alone does not account for burial numbers. In both periods, only a segment of the population seems to have been formally buried. In early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries, age appears to have played a role in burial practices. While some sites like Great Chesterford contain many infant and fetal remains, such cases are rare, implying alternative forms of disposal for the very young. Other groups may also have been excluded, such as the enslaved or those not considered culturally English, including native Britons. The limited number of burials across large areas of Western and Northern Britain, where Anglo-Saxon influence is minimal, aligns with the relatively sparse burial evidence even in the southeast. Most early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries cluster along the eastern coastline and the upper Thames Valley, gradually expanding across England to the east of a diagonal line from Dorset to Tyne and Ware. Some regions, like the Weald of Kent and Sussex, show fewer burials, possibly because they were only seasonally inhabited, with the dead returned to ancestral territories. Other gaps correspond to areas of environmental change, such as flooding in the fens and Humber wetlands. Still, some areas, like parts of Hertfordshire, Essex, Suffolk, and Yorkshire, show unexpected absences, which may suggest differences in local burial customs or the presence of remaining British communities. Although difficult to prove, these patterns sometimes correlate with literary references to post-Roman British kingdoms, such as Elmet. Cemeteries were often established near prominent landmarks, including ancient burial mounds. The most common were prehistoric barrows, but Anglo-Saxon burials have also been found near Neolithic monuments, Roman ruins, and even natural mounds mistaken for earlier graves. These features likely served as points of orientation and helped connect new communities to the ancestral landscape. Establishing burials near such sites may have been a way to claim ownership of the land and its resources as heirs to those who came before. Of the total number of known cemeteries, only a small fraction, around 3%, have been thoroughly excavated and documented in a way that allows for statistical analysis. This limited dataset remains the primary basis for much of today's scholarly understanding. Approximately 800 cemeteries have been broadly dated, with about 60% belonging to the 5th and 6th centuries, and around a third to the 6th and 7th. Only a small portion, about 7%, spans both periods. Burial practices also vary. About 70 cemeteries contain only cremations. 175 have both cremation and inhumation, and the rest are inhumation only. Cremation was more common in the early period, while inhumation continued throughout. A few early inhumations may represent immigrant graves, but cremations appear to mark the initial phase of Anglo-Saxon presence in Britain. The earliest examples date to the early 5th century. Although some late Roman cemeteries, like Lankhill's near Winchester, include unurned cremations, 2 urned burials from Wasperton have been radiocarbon dated to around 400. Cremation sites are distributed across southern and eastern England, with major concentrations in Norfolk, Lincolnshire, and eastern Yorkshire. Large cemeteries such as Spong Hill, Sancton, and Cleetham each contain over 1,500 burials, suggesting they served entire districts and may have functioned as ceremonial centers for scattered communities. Continental practices indicate that cremation pyres were usually built within cemetery grounds, but in Britain, such pyres are rarely found. Instead, it seems likely that cremation occurred elsewhere, and the ashes were later brought to the cemetery for burial. These funerals were public, symbolic acts that carried deep social meaning. The design and decoration of the cremation urns often reflected the age, gender, and status of the deceased, indicating that their containers were carefully chosen to match individual identity. Some cemeteries include built features associated with cremation, such as the 4-post structures at Appledown in Sussex, which have been interpreted as cremation shelters. Urns were sometimes buried in clusters, suggesting family plots. At Cleetham, repeated use of small, overlapping burial pits has helped reconstruct the relative timeline of cremation activity. However, most urns were placed in isolated pits that did not intersect. Although most cremation burials lacked additional grave goods, around 10% included at least one item such as grooming tools, tweezers, razors, or combs made of bone or antler. These items hint at personal identity and social role, even in death. Personal grooming tools are found in the graves of both adults and the young. Some of these items were burned along with the body, while others were added after the cremation. Their presence suggests a symbolic importance during the funeral. Other objects were also included, either placed on the pyre or added later. In a minority of graves, archaeologists have discovered glass beads, small containers, brooches, spindle whorls, and combs. Larger items such as swords, spears, or shields are very rare in cremation burials, but they may have been present during the cremation process and not survived. By the late 5th century, it became more common to find a second, usually plain urn, or sometimes 2, accompanying the main burial, often containing cremated horse remains. These were not linked to the sex or age of the deceased. The horses themselves do not seem to have been used for riding, and unlike the rare horse burials in inhumation cemeteries that may signal status, these cremated horse remains might have represented a social or religious tradition. The names of early Saxon leaders, Hengist and Horsa, both meaning horse, hint at this animal's symbolic importance. Later disapproval from Roman Church representatives regarding English treatment of horses may also be related. The Anglo-Saxon cremation tradition closely resembles those found in parts of northern Germany and the German-Danish borderlands, particularly regions like Schleswig, Holstein, Mecklenburg, and the island of Fyn. Saxon pottery styles are more common in the former, while Anglian styles align with the latter. Yet these styles were already blending on the continent by the 4th century, and the variations found in England suggest a more complex picture than previously thought. No single cemetery in Britain has been definitively traced back to a specific area in Germany. Instead, it appears that cultural practices were shaped both by migration and local adaptation. People already living in Britain also adopted these customs in various ways, and cemeteries show a wide range of influences. In some cases, material culture may have been deliberately used to distinguish communities from their neighbors. Inhumation burials, by contrast, provide a different kind of insight. They give more complete skeletal evidence, along with grave goods and occasional traces of fabrics or burial furnishings. Large cemeteries composed solely of inhumations are rare. Most contain only a few dozen to a few hundred graves, suggesting they belonged to small communities of 20 to 60 people. These burial sites were usually well organized, with most graves following one or two main orientations and minimal overlapping, indicating that the graves were likely marked above ground. The most common orientation is west to east, consistent with late Roman traditions, although some sites, such as Castledyke South in Barton-upon-Humber, show more variation. Most bodies were laid on their backs with legs extended, although flexed or crouched positions do occur. Occasionally, graves contain more than one person, typically an adult and a child, possibly a mother and her infant. The preservation of skeletal remains depends on soil conditions. In areas with chalk or limestone, bones tend to survive well, whereas acidic soils like sand or clay often result in poor preservation. When bones are well preserved, it is possible to estimate the age and sex of the deceased, though age estimates become less accurate beyond middle age, and sex determination is less reliable for children and teenagers. Generally, individuals appear to have been in good health. Dental decay was low, likely due to the absence of refined sugar, and some people lived with serious injuries, healed fractures, or even signs of surgery. In some cases, the cause of death is evident, especially in violent deaths, though clear evidence of combat injuries is uncommon. The biological sex of a skeleton can be compared to the gender suggested by associated grave goods. While jewelry is usually found in female graves, some male burials include such items, indicating regional variation. At West Heslerton, annular brooches are found with several male skeletons, implying this was locally accepted. Elsewhere, such as at Buckland in Dover, women were sometimes buried with weapons. This variation suggests that relying solely on artifacts to determine gender can occasionally be misleading. However, grave goods in general do reflect differences based on age and gender, with specific objects and clothing styles marking masculine or feminine identity. About half of all individuals, regardless of sex, were buried without any goods. Young children were usually buried with gender-neutral items. Between ages 7 and 12, grave goods begin to reflect gender roles more clearly, though many of these items appear to have been handed down. Warrior burials from the early to mid-5th century are relatively rare, but their frequency increases through the 6th century, peaking when nearly half of all adult male graves contain weapons. The most commonly found weapon is the spear, present in about 80% of warrior burials, followed by shields in roughly half. Other weapons, such as axes, swords, or arrows, appear in only about 10% of cases. These items likely belonged to a warrior class, which seems to have been hereditary. Some weapon graves belong to individuals too young, elderly, or infirm to have fought, suggesting that weapons symbolized social rank. In some warrior graves, board games were also included, hinting at leisure and status. Other men were buried with everyday tools such as knives, shears, or tweezers, often found near the waist as if worn on a belt. People were usually buried wearing their regular clothing, tunic and belted trousers, with some also wearing a coat or cloak. Of all the objects found in female burials, brooches stand out as the most distinctive. These came in many forms and were often used to fasten clothing, though their decorative nature also made them symbols of status and wealth. Alongside brooches, other items like bead strings, sleeve clasps, belts, and knives were typically included. In regions associated with Anglian influence, women were commonly buried with annular, cruciform, square-headed, and small, long brooches, usually placed one on each shoulder and one on the chest. These were often accompanied by girdle hangers and sleeve clasps. In contrast, areas thought of as Saxon-favored disc, button, saucer, and applied brooches, usually found in pairs or aligned down the upper body. Pendants made from Roman coins and bead strings placed around the waist were also common. In the Jutish regions of Kent and Hampshire, brooch styles and clothing preferences were again distinct. These regional patterns in brooch use and dress styles show that cultural traditions varied widely, though some cemeteries reveal mixed or overlapping styles, suggesting that cultural identities were not strictly separated. East Kent, for instance, displayed elements of both Saxon and Anglian traditions, as well as traits from southern Scandinavia. This created a uniquely Kentish material culture, shaped by a blend of influences, enhanced by the area's position between the English Channel and the Wantsum Channel. The presence of gold bracteates, medallion-like ornaments often bearing imagery ultimately derived from Roman emperors, helped further distinguish this region's identity. The origins of these brooch types varied significantly. While some early examples like square-headed or small long brooches were made in continental Europe and imported to Britain, most styles were soon being produced locally. Interestingly, even imported brooches were often used in ways that differed from their continental counterparts. Not all available continental types made it to Britain, making it hard to tell whether a grave belonged to a recent immigrant or a local adopting new styles. Other brooch types, such as disc, annular, and applied saucer brooches, appear to have been developed in Britain, evolving from late Roman-British metalwork traditions. Even those considered Germanic in style often show signs of local craftsmanship, especially in the east of England. The widespread use of annular brooches there, which lack close continental parallels, may reflect strong native influence, although their relatively late appearance challenges the idea of uninterrupted continuity from Roman Britain. Like cremations, inhumations seem to reflect social status within communities, although this remains open to interpretation. Those excluded from formal burial, perhaps due to age, ethnicity, or social rank, likely represented the lowest status. Individuals buried without grave goods were probably of modest standing, while those with richer collections were wealthier. By the mid-6th century, wealth became more concentrated, and high-status items like brooches appeared in fewer graves. At sites like Alton in Hampshire, such items clustered in specific areas, suggesting the presence of elite families. However, even the wealthiest graves were not spatially isolated. They were intermingled with more modest burials, possibly indicating that leaders were buried within extended households, rather than as isolated chieftains. In some cemeteries, like Norton in Cleveland, weapon burials for men occurred in roughly equal numbers to fully adorned female burials, possibly signifying high-status couples. Where graves are grouped into apparent family plots, social differences are more pronounced within those groups than between them, indicating variations of status within extended kinship networks. modern scientific methods have opened new ways to study the early English settlements. One of the earliest tools used is the analysis of ancient plant life. Vegetation patterns recorded in pollen samples can reflect human activity and population density. Surprisingly, much of England shows no signs of reforestation after the Roman period, which one might expect if there had been widespread population collapse. In fact, some areas show increased human impact on the environment, hinting at stable or growing populations. One explanation is that migration occurred on a large scale, replacing many of the native Britons. There is literary and linguistic evidence that some Britons emigrated to areas like Brittany, but complete population turnover without mass abandonment of farmland seems unlikely. The most straightforward interpretation is that farming, and thus the farming population, continued with minimal disruption. Researchers have also attempted to trace population movements through physical anthropology. In the 19th century, this involved questionable methods like measuring skulls or noting skin color. While such racial profiling fell out of favor after the Second World War, it has since returned in a more refined form through forensic science. However, studies have found less difference in skull shape between Romano-British and Anglo-Saxon skeletons than between Anglo-Saxon and later medieval ones. For instance, burials at Cannington in Somerset show little change from Roman to Saxon times, suggesting continuity rather than replacement. Larger-scale studies of Anglo-Saxon cemeteries have found that men buried with weapons were, on average, taller than those without. This has been interpreted as a sign that these were incoming Saxons, while shorter men might have been native Britons. Height can be influenced by diet and health, though, and similar variations are not as clear in women's graves. Considering the diverse backgrounds of both Romano-Britons and the newcomers, trying to identify racial differences through physical features alone remains highly problematic. A more focused approach has been to examine specific skeletal features. One example is dental development. Studies comparing Roman and Saxon cemeteries have shown that burial style doesn't necessarily match population origin. Sites like Baronsfield and Queenford Farm in Oxfordshire may have been used by the same community over time, with people simply changing their burial customs. Isotope analysis offers another promising method. Isotopes, variants of chemical elements, can indicate both diet and geographical origin. Oxygen isotopes vary with climate, while strontium reflects local geology. Since these elements are fixed in tooth enamel during childhood, they provide clues about where a person grew up. Roman cemeteries, such as those in York, reveal individuals who likely came from Central Europe, the Mediterranean, or North Africa, confirming the empire's diverse population. At Lankhills in Winchester, some graves once thought to be from Pannonia were later shown through isotope testing to belong to locals, while a few graves thought to be native were actually of foreign origin. Unfortunately, isotope testing of 5th and 6th century burials is still limited. A small study of remains at West Heslerton, an Anglian cemetery, found that most individuals were either locals or from Western Britain, with only a few from the continent. At Wasperton in Warwickshire, remains from both Roman and Anglo-Saxon periods mostly came from children raised in the local area, with some influence from Western Britain and the Mediterranean, but little evidence for migration from Northern Europe. In East Kent, isotopic analysis of 8 out of 51 individuals at Ringlemere Farm suggested that a few had migrated from Frisia. Artifacts linked to northern France and Germany support this, dating from the mid to late 5th century. Still, these are small data sets, and more widespread use of such technology is needed for firmer conclusions. Finally, Archaeogenetics, using genetics to study ancient populations, has emerged since the Second World War. While breakthroughs in ancient DNA analysis have occurred, most genetic research has focused on modern populations, working backward to reconstruct past migrations. This method involves several challenges, including how fast genetic mutations accumulate over time. Nonetheless, some large-scale patterns have emerged. For example, mitochondrial DNA, passed down from mothers, shows only gradual change across Europe. But the Y chromosome, inherited from fathers, shows a divide between an Atlantic genetic zone, extending from the Basque region to the western British Isles, and a Central European zone that includes most of England. This suggests that male line ancestry in Western Britain may differ from that in the rest of the country. In an effort to understand the genetic impact of early migration to Britain, a study analyzed populations along a line stretching from Norfolk to Anglesey. Findings published in 2002 showed that genetic patterns across England appeared fairly uniform, yet contrasted notably with Wales. Researchers suggested this indicated a substantial replacement of the lowland British population by newcomers from Friesland, where similar genetic signatures were found. Due to criticism of this interpretation, one of the authors, joined by new collaborators, proposed in 2006 that the same genetic outcome could result from a form of social inequality. If the early migrants, even if initially only a small fraction of the male population, held a strong reproductive advantage, they could have significantly shaped the gene pool over time. However, the idea that such dominance could persist over several centuries seems unlikely, especially given the complexity and variation of both British and Germanic populations. Still, this alternative model broadened the interpretive possibilities. Another investigation into Y chromosome variation in 2003 found a surprising genetic similarity between people in Britain and the Basque region. Continental influence was strongest in areas like East Anglia, the northeast, and the Thames Valley, while Wales, the southwest, and southeastern England showed much less similarity to continental populations. Estimates suggested an average of 38% continental genetic contribution in England, compared to only 13% in Wales. However, this study assumed a previously uniform native population and did not date the migrations. As a result, the findings portrayed the English population as more diverse than once believed. In some regions of eastern and central England, the data closely resembled that from Scandinavia and northern Germany, though the same was not true for southern England or southern Scotland. The inability to clearly differentiate between early Anglo-Saxon and later Viking contributions made it likely that repeated migrations over thousands of years had amplified the continental genetic presence in certain areas. A follow-up review in 2006 concluded that English genetic markers aligned more closely with Belgium than with any Scandinavian source, casting doubt on the scale of Germanic migration after the Roman era. It suggested instead that the main elements of Britain's genetic makeup had already been in place since the post-Ice Age recolonization. Nevertheless, this study relied on the slowest mutation rate models, potentially underestimating more recent historical contributions. A broader review of these genetic studies did not support large-scale population turnover during the migration period. It acknowledged the genetic similarities between parts of eastern England and regions of Scandinavia and northwestern Germany, but emphasized that these connections remained undated and numerically uncertain. Instead, it pointed to repeated waves of interaction and settlement from as far back as the end of the Ice Age, followed by reinforcement through Neolithic and later prehistoric movements, and finally by migration period and Viking Age arrivals. Overall, although the field of archaeogenetics provides valuable new insights into the nature of early English settlement, it still lacks consistent methodologies across studies, making direct comparisons difficult. While prehistoric populations may have been mobile, the onset of agriculture likely led to more stable tribal boundaries, limiting genetic exchange. Roman authors like Tacitus already described distinct regional physical traits around the year 100, suggesting such differences could have lasted well into the Anglo-Saxon period. Future genetic research must therefore compare local communities across Britain as well as with foreign groups, in order to understand both regional variation and broader population movements. Although evidence of early Anglo-Saxon settlements was first uncovered during quarrying in the 1920s, serious academic research into these sites only began after the Second World War. The types of buildings and artifacts found at these sites differ significantly from those seen in late Roman Britain. Structures were exclusively timber-built, with roofs made of thatch or wooden shingles, and they generally fell into two main categories: sunken-featured buildings and post-hole constructed halls. In rare cases, some settlements like those at Barton Court Farm in Oxfordshire and Orton Hall Farm near Peterborough may show some continuity from Roman to Anglo-Saxon occupation, but these are exceptions. Most early Anglo-Saxon communities were established on previously unused land. Sunken featured buildings are identified by shallow, flat-bottomed pits, usually no more than a meter deep, with oval or rectangular shapes. These structures tended to be small, often no larger than 8 by 5 meters. Around the edges of the pit were sets of post holes that supported a superstructure, possibly with turf walls. The purpose of the pit is debated. Some believe it formed the floor, while others argue for suspended wooden flooring. Excavations at sites like West Stow have provided support for both interpretations, though current opinion favors the suspended floor model. Originally, these buildings were thought to be dwellings, but the discovery of larger post-built halls led to new theories. The presence of loom weights has led some archaeologists to view them as weaving sheds, though actual weaving likely occurred elsewhere. Other interpretations suggest they may have been grain storage facilities or secondary sleeping quarters. Despite the variety of possible functions, sunken-featured buildings are often the most visible feature in early Anglo-Saxon settlements, appearing clearly in aerial surveys. However, they are not found at every site. Post-hole buildings, commonly referred to as halls, are larger than sunken-featured buildings and harder to detect archaeologically, as they are only indicated by the post holes marking their perimeter. These buildings tend to be rectangular with soft corners, typically measuring between 6 and 11 meters in length and about half as wide. Most were single-room structures, though some included internal partitions. Doors were usually placed at the center of the long walls, facing each other, similar to descriptions found in early medieval literature. Evidence of hearths is rare, but studies of floor construction at places like West Heslerton suggest that the buildings had wooden floors supported by outer walls. Unlike the sunken-featured buildings, these halls do not appear to be derived from continental designs. With few exceptions, the large aisled buildings used for both people and livestock in parts of Western Germania were almost absent from Anglo-Saxon England. Instead, these halls seem to reflect a blend of native Romano-British building traditions and smaller-scale influences from Germanic areas. This mixture of design elements suggests that early Anglo-Saxon architecture was shaped by both local heritage and external contact. Early Anglo-Saxon settlements were often unbounded and spread irregularly across the landscape, making full excavation difficult. Some of these communities have been described as shifting or wandering settlements, particularly in continental contexts. In England, however, the degree of movement varied. At Mucking in Essex, for instance, archaeologists uncovered a complex, multi-phase landscape that included earlier Roman enclosures and a cemetery that fell out of use in the 3rd century. After this, an Anglo-Saxon settlement emerged, featuring 53 post-hole buildings and 203 sunken-featured buildings. Beginning in the early 5th century, this settlement likely housed about 100 people at any given time, using around 10 halls and 14 sunken structures. While the size of the buildings themselves doesn't show much social distinction, some graves were notably richer in artifacts, hinting at a social hierarchy. The overall layout has been interpreted as a mobile community made up of multiple households, with prominent individuals recognized by the items buried with them, such as weapons and jewelry. Another site, West Stow in Suffolk, also suggests the gradual replacement of buildings over time, but the settlement location remained more stable. Here, excavators identified 14 halls and 69 sunken featured buildings, interpreted as belonging to 4 extended households. Each group had its own large hall and several auxiliary buildings, rebuilt periodically from the 5th to 7th centuries. Although not many artifacts were recovered from the settlement itself, the nearby cemetery, which had been excavated in the 19th century, contained a range of grave goods, including weapons and decorative brooches. These findings imply the existence of sizable and hierarchically structured households. Some settlements, however, show signs of continuous occupation over much longer periods. Catalum, for example, evolved steadily from the 5th to the 9th centuries, with numerous phases of construction occurring in the same location. Another significant site is West Heslerton, in the Vale of Pickering. There, a large settlement covering 22.5 hectares was uncovered, with around 80 to 90 timber-framed buildings and 140 sunken featured structures, along with an associated cemetery. The Anglo-Saxon occupation replaced an earlier Roman settlement lower down the slope, which had likely been abandoned around the year 400 due to worsening environmental conditions. The new village developed upslope near a Roman religious site that had remained active into the 4th century and was apparently respected afterward. The cemetery was established within an older sacred landscape that included a henge and a round barrow. Occupation of the site spanned more than 4 centuries. Unlike at Mucking and West Stow, where sunken featured buildings tended to cluster around the halls, part of West Heslerton was dominated by these smaller structures, suggesting the presence of a dedicated craft or industrial zone. Activities like metalworking, textile production, butchery, and malting appear to have been carried out away from residential areas. The settlement likely supported a community of about 75 people, organized into 10 households, each anchored by a large timber hall built with skilled carpentry. Archaeologists recovered nearly 9,000 pieces of Anglo-Saxon pottery, although that number was overshadowed by 30 kilograms of Roman-era pottery from the nearby shrine site. To better understand the regional context, researchers undertook the most extensive survey of its kind in Britain, mapping an 8.5-kilometer-long corridor of the Derwent Valley and neighboring areas. This revealed even larger settlements at East Heslerton and Sherburn, marked by dense clusters of sunken featured buildings. Along the edge of the valley's wetlands, small settlements appeared approximately every 800 meters, with larger communities every 2.5 kilometers. Altogether, Around 1,300 sunken featured buildings were identified. These settlements seem to be in use at the same time, suggesting an intensely occupied and cultivated landscape. This phase of land use, which stretched back to the Bronze Age, came to an end in the 9th century when the area was abandoned and eventually converted to farmland. Despite similarities in architectural forms across early Anglo-Saxon England, interpretations of settlement size, density, and land use vary. Some of these differences might reflect genuine regional variations in settlement structure and social organization, but they may also result from the uneven nature of modern excavation efforts and the challenges posed by the large scale of these dispersed communities. As such, debates about the mobility or permanence of settlements remain open, shaped as much by archaeological data as by the limits of current research. By the year 410, people living within the boundaries of the former Roman diocese in Britain spoke either Latin, Brittonic, a form of British Celtic, or both. Latin was more common in the lowland regions. Personal names from the early 5th century also reflected this linguistic landscape, being primarily Latin or Celtic, with some instances of Greek. Although Latin largely disappeared as a spoken language, it continued to be used for Christian religious purposes, particularly in inscriptions found in Wales and more sparsely in the southwest of England, southern Scotland, and northern England. On the other hand, Brittonic poetry began to appear by the 6th century, although no early inscriptions in the Celtic language have survived on stone. During the Roman era, Brittonic absorbed a substantial number of Latin words due to Latin's higher social prestige, but this borrowing greatly declined as Latin's influence waned. Interestingly, Highland Brittonic, later giving rise to Welsh, Breton, and Cornish, underwent sound changes thought to be influenced by an influx of Latin-speaking settlers from the lowlands. Though these newcomers eventually adopted the local Celtic dialect, they introduced Latin-based phonological and structural traits that others in the region found appealing, leading to rapid linguistic evolution and the eventual formation of medieval Welsh. While Germanic speech may have existed in Roman Britain to a limited degree, it only became widely used following Saxon dominance in the lowland areas. By around 570, Old English had spread extensively and was displacing earlier languages across these regions. Despite the near absence of written Old English prior to around 600, with only a few scratched words on artifacts and much later textual records, its early presence and growing influence can be inferred through place names and the linguistic shift that followed. As a Germanic language, Old English incorporated very few words from Latin or Brittonic before the 7th century, and the vast majority of place names in England date from the Old English period onward. Although some researchers have tried to identify pre-English place names, such examples remain rare and have little impact on the broader understanding. Place name scholars have often championed the theory of mass migration, suggesting that large numbers of newcomers overwhelmed local populations and suppressed their native languages, a view that remains influential. The linguistic data supporting this view is solid, but interpretations vary. From a contact linguistics perspective, it's common for speakers of a lower prestige language to adopt words from a higher prestige one, and for bilingualism to favor the dominant language. Over time, this often leads to the extinction of the less prestigious tongue, as seen in the replacement of Gaulish by Latin in France or Pictish by Gaelic in Scotland. In Roman Britain, Latin was adopted widely in the lowlands and borrowed into Highland Brittonic. If the Saxon conquest established Old English as a high-status language, then the disappearance of earlier languages, and the limited number of loanwords would follow naturally. This is exactly what the evidence suggests. Phonology, rather than vocabulary, offers more nuanced clues about linguistic interaction. If Latin had already displaced much of Brittonic in southeastern Britain during the Roman period, early Germanic settlers would have encountered both Latin and a Latin-influenced Celtic dialect. While some scholars argue that Brittonic influenced Old English structurally, such claims are debated and mostly apply to later phases of English expansion into the Pennines and Western regions. Any earlier influence may have affected pronunciation more than grammar, but these changes were modest compared to the impact of Latin on Celtic speech. This suggests different dynamics in how languages interacted socially. Latin-accented Celtic may have been fashionable among the Highland Britons, but it's unlikely that Saxons would have favored similarly accented English. According to Bede, language was a defining marker of ethnic identity in Britain, and the minimal phonological shifts in Old English indicate that native Britons had to learn the conqueror's language with great precision to assimilate. Place names offer further insight into spoken language. During the Roman era, many place names in Britain were Latinized versions of Brittonic names, with a few being purely Latin. But outside Cornwall, and to a much lesser extent, parts of northern Cumbria, very few place names in England today can be traced back to the period before Old English spread. Even in areas where pre-English names might be expected, such as Cheshire, only a small fraction of the several hundred known names are Brittonic in origin, and none are clearly Latin. This trend is even more pronounced in eastern counties like Hertfordshire, Leicestershire, and Suffolk. This near-total replacement of earlier place names indicates a dramatic cultural and linguistic shift in England that seems even more complete than similar changes in continental regions. While some might attribute this shift to the scale of Germanic migration, the same pattern of name loss occurred in areas where Anglo-Saxon settlement was minimal or absent, such as Wales and Cornwall. Interestingly, some of the densest surviving Romano-British place names are along the southeastern coast of England, including locations like Reculver, Dover, and Canterbury. This suggests that the loss of Roman period names was a broader Romano-British phenomenon, rather than something solely caused by Saxon newcomers. Still, knowledge of ancient place names is limited. Fewer than 250 are currently known. Notable exceptions, such as London and Lincoln, have endured, but others, like Aquae Sulis, now Bath, are no longer commonly used. Some English place names do contain Latin roots. Examples include words like fons, spring, in Bedfont, vicus, settlement, in Wickham, campus, field, in Campsie, and portus, port, in Portland. These suggest that a few Latin terms made their way into early English vocabulary, especially in southern England, though such borrowings remain rare. Because there are almost no surviving texts from the early period, our knowledge of English place names before around 670 is extremely limited. In the early 20th century, scholars assumed that names referencing pagan beliefs or deities, such as Wednesbury, or those ending in ingas, like Hastings, were very old and predated Christianity. However, research in the 1960s overturned this view. Names linked to pagan traditions now appear to have originated during the later stages of the Christian conversion, not before. Likewise, ingas names show no connection to early burial grounds, making them unlikely to date from the earliest Anglo-Saxon settlements. Instead, more attention has been paid to topographical names containing elements like wood, ford, or hill, which may be just as early or even earlier than many settlement-based names. Early literary sources suggest that place names were gradually altered or replaced over extended periods. Interestingly, in texts written up to the early 8th century, mainly by Anglo-Saxon churchmen, up to a quarter of the recorded place, names were not originally English. Bede, for example, provides insight into the renaming of Verulamium. In his time, it was referred to in English as either Uerlamacestir or Uecklingacestir. Eventually, all of these names disappeared, replaced by the saint's name St. Albans, although part of the older name still survives in the modern Watling Street. The evolution of the city we now call York is another clear example. Its original name, Eburicum, became Eoforwich under the Anglo-Saxons, then Jorvik under Scandinavian influence, and finally York. Without documentation, we would never know these names all referred to the same place. This shows how place names in early Anglo-Saxon times were not fixed, but rather fluid. Pronunciations changed, alternative names competed for use, and non-English names were often lost first. Most surviving records naturally focus on prominent locations, so many smaller Brittonic names may have persisted well into later periods before being gradually replaced. In some cases, they were poorly substituted, leaving behind scattered evidence in later documents. One exception to this pattern appears in river names. While many eastern rivers retained only major names from the earlier period, in the West, even minor rivers managed to preserve older names. It's also worth rethinking the assumption that only English-speaking people lived in places with English names. For instance, some Welsh speakers were living in manors listed in the Domesday Book that had English names, and this may have been common during earlier centuries too. As Brittonic or Latin speakers were slowly integrated into an Anglo-Saxon cultural world, many locations were renamed by their new English-speaking elites. It is possible that both the older and newer names coexisted for some time. Bede's account of St. Albans supports this idea, and the 9th century history of the Britons records alternative names for several English locations, possibly reflecting how some of these older names remained in local use. The widespread shifting of rural settlements during the Anglo-Saxon era may also help explain why so many names changed. In many cases, the names we have today reflect only the final stages of settlement in a particular location, often recorded between 800 and 1100 in late Anglo-Saxon documents or the Domesday Book. Even some names mentioned by Bede in the 8th century didn't survive this process. As settlements moved and changed hands, often in new social contexts, renaming was frequent. This high turnover of names reflects the generally low levels of written estate administration at the time. Most English place names are either possessive, naming the landowner, or describe some aspect of the local landscape. The fact that these new names were coined in Old English rather than Latin or Brittonic simply reflects the broader pattern of linguistic and settlement change. The early development of Old English offers valuable clues about the social structure, cultural values, and religious beliefs during the migration period. Although it's difficult to determine exact dates before Old English became a written language, comparisons with other Germanic languages and Roman accounts help shed light on its origins. Scholars have recently emphasized kinship, warrior bands, assemblies, and leadership as key social components. Kinship, referred to in Old English as sin, was already described by the Roman historian Tacitus as central to tribal organization. In early England, while large-scale warfare may have been unlikely, the kin group remained essential for personal protection, supporting its members in legal matters feuds, compensation disputes, and oaths. Without a kin group, an individual was exposed and vulnerable. Feuding was not just common, but necessary. It served as the primary means of law enforcement, encouraging families to negotiate and compensate rather than escalate violence. The survival and unity of the kindred were crucial responsibilities for free men. Early Germanic societies were shaped heavily by warfare, whether tied to feuds among kin, raiding with a warband, or intertribal conflicts. The warband formed the second key institution, led by a chieftain known as the ring giver, who rewarded loyalty with gifts, often won through raids or tribute. These groups were bound more by personal allegiance than formal discipline, creating bonds that sometimes transcended family and tribal lines. This pattern of loyalty, noted by Bede in the case of King Oswin's warriors, was common in this period. The tribal assembly, described by Tacitus, was a central institution where armed freemen gathered to make decisions and approve actions, often signaled by striking their weapons together. These gatherings were not only political, but also military in character, with participation limited to those who bore arms. The Old English word for law shares roots with terms related to custom and religious practice, hinting at the deep connection between governance and belief. In early Germanic religion, Tiw was a deity associated with both war and justice, though this role shifted to Woden as society evolved, especially during migration. The right to participate in assemblies was exclusive to free men, clearly distinguishing them from dependent classes. At a more local level, lordship was vested in those with the right to bear arms. The Old English term freya could refer to a household lord, one with authority over land and dependents, and eventually came to denote higher-ranking leaders, even kings. Another term, Dryten, meaning warband leader, appears in early poetry to describe rulers, though signing later became more widely used. This transition reflects the evolution from tribal chieftaincies to more formal kingship, as seen in the Frankish and Gothic worlds, where hereditary succession replaced selection by the community. Although linguistic evidence is difficult to date precisely, it helps us interpret archaeological and historical records and provides broader context. By the late 4th and early 5th centuries, Roman control along the Atlantic and North Sea coasts had weakened, exposing Britain to increasing raids from across the seas. The decline in trade with the Mediterranean suggests piracy was widespread, a view supported by contemporary accounts. Raids may explain the presence of late Roman artifacts in Ireland, Scotland, and coastal Germany, though other factors like diplomacy and mercenary service may have contributed as well. The presence of hordes in southern and eastern Britain could indicate insecurity, though their meaning remains debated. Irish raids also resulted in settlement in parts of southwest Wales, as shown by Ogham inscriptions and Irish names in local royal genealogies. In one case, an Ogham inscription indicates that an Irish individual was buried as far east as Silchester. Some Irish troops, known as Attacati, also served on the continent and may have been recruited from Britain. In Scotland, elite sites like Traproin Law, Dumbarton Rock, and Edinburgh were centers of activity, especially in the 5th century. In the 6th, this pattern narrowed mainly to Dumbarton and Edinburgh. After Rome withdrew, Britain had to defend itself. Lacking military resources, local rulers hired foreign fighters, just as Roman authorities had done before. Gildas's narrative about the hiring, empowerment, and eventual revolt of the Saxons seems broadly plausible. Early sources support the idea of military conquest over mass migration, which fits with the limited archaeological evidence for Anglo-Saxon presence before 450. The Saxons may initially have served as a regional military force for the remnants of Roman Britain, numbering in the hundreds or low thousands. But once they rebelled, they quickly took control. The Gallic Chronicle of 452 mentions Saxon dominance in Britain by 441. Archaeologists place the earliest Anglo-Saxon burials in the second quarter of the 5th century, aligning with the rise of Saxon power, the collapse of British coinage and taxation, and the start of distinctive Anglo-Saxon cultural markers. All of these developments likely occurred within a single generation, marking the real beginning of Anglo-Saxon England. One lingering question is how Anglo-Saxon language and culture came to dominate the British lowlands so completely, especially when compared with the more gradual cultural blending seen in Gaul. There, Frankish settlers adopted Roman customs and Latin, becoming part of the local culture. In contrast, Anglo-Saxon culture seems to have replaced what came before. One theory holds that this reflects the sheer number of migrants to Britain, but this explanation has been questioned. During the late 20th century, scholars proposed alternative models involving cultural assimilation, elite influence, and imitation, similar to how Romanization had worked earlier. These models suggest that a small group of Germanic newcomers could have transformed local culture by setting trends that others followed. Looking across linguistic, archaeological, and historical evidence, the picture remains complex. But the most consistent interpretation is one of significant cultural change paired with broad population continuity. This fits well with environmental and scientific data, particularly in paleobotany. Isotope studies, although limited in number, have identified migration from both continental Europe and Western Britain into the East, but most of the evidence still points to continuity. In fact, more signs of foreign migration are found in the Roman period than in the centuries that followed. Genetic studies have sparked debate about the scale of migration into Britain during the early Anglo-Saxon period, but there is still no solid proof of a large influx of settlers crossing the North Sea. In fact, most scientific interpretations lean toward a scenario where cultural adoption played as much of a role as actual migration. It seems increasingly likely that a significant portion of the population remained local, and that the transformation of culture was driven more by assimilation than replacement. Still, the idea that a small elite imposed such sweeping cultural change poses a challenge, especially when we consider that a similar transformation didn't occur in places like Gaul. This points to the need for a more refined understanding of cultural change, one that can explain how the distinctly Anglo-Saxon world replaced the Romano-British way of life, and how this differed so dramatically from what happened elsewhere during the Roman to barbarian transition. Britain held a unique place in the Roman Empire. It was conquered later than most provinces, remained an island frontier under heavy military presence, and never integrated into the empire as deeply as regions like Gaul or Spain. No Britons are known to have risen to imperial office, governed provinces, commanded armies, or founded notable noble lineages before 400. Roman writers often portrayed Britons with disdain, and even British authors like Gildas acknowledged the cultural divide between the native population and the Roman world, describing the Romans as distinctly superior. Romanization in Britain appears to have been partial and superficial, a local adaptation rather than full absorption into Roman identity. The withdrawal of coin imports may have marked the final breakdown of Roman Britain. A series of military uprisings aimed at reviving imperial power ultimately failed, leaving the island vulnerable to outside attacks. In 407, many of Britain's defensive troops were redeployed to the continent and never returned. Unlike other provinces, Britain was effectively abandoned once Emperor Honorius failed to reclaim it after 410. Though some influence from the continent may have lingered, Britain was left without Roman military protection or governance. By the 430s, many Roman features of British society were fading fast. No imperial officials remained, towns were in decline, buildings stood abandoned or repurposed, and coinage was becoming increasingly devalued. Economic systems like taxation and long-distance trade were breaking down. In stark contrast, Gaul still maintained Roman garrisons and political leadership into the late 5th century. Its towns shrank in size but were fortified and remained occupied, especially around cathedrals, under the guidance of bishops. In Britain, however, there is little evidence of such ecclesiastical centers, except perhaps at Lincoln. Urban areas were likely used as refuges, but were no longer truly functional, as their defensive walls belonged to a much earlier era and could no longer offer reliable protection. Some historians believe that the Roman administrative system in Britain collapsed rapidly after 410, giving rise to many small-scale communities. This theory often assumes that larger political entities would have resisted the Saxons more effectively. However, this overlooks the fundamental difference in societal structure. Only the Saxons were organized for sustained warfare. Evidence of clipped Roman coins indicates that some Romanized local governments may have survived for a time, but the political system that existed before the Saxon revolt was already weak and transitional. Ultimately, the British state that the Anglo-Saxons displaced was far less cohesive, militarily and economically, than its counterpart in Gaul. The Saxons also differed from the Franks. The Franks entered the Roman world gradually, allowing time for cultural adaptation. While numerous, they remained close to the borders and didn't penetrate deeply at first. Over time, Frankish kingship took shape, especially under Clovis, whose military victories helped unify Gaul and integrate it into a new political order. These kings assumed Roman administrative roles, collecting taxes, issuing coins, appointing governors, and forged alliances with local elites, particularly through the church. The Franks' conversion to Christianity created common ground with the Gallo-Roman clergy, allowing cooperation based on shared interests. By contrast, the Saxons were seen as raiders, later hired soldiers, and then mutinous troops who plundered the diocese. Their rise to power was swift and chaotic, and while their original numbers were likely small, other war bands soon joined them, creating a fragmented and volatile environment in mid-5th century Britain. Unlike in Gaul, no strong central authority emerged to manage this upheaval. Kingship was underdeveloped in northern Germany and Scandinavia, and even in the 8th century, the continental Saxons managed without monarchs. Early Anglo-Saxon England reflected this low level of social hierarchy, unlike the increasingly king-centered society of the Franks. The British elite, lacking functional taxation, stable currency, trade networks, or fortified towns, were in no position to negotiate or collaborate. There was no viable framework for peaceful coexistence. Archaeological findings from early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries point to a society accessing significant quantities of metal, particularly silver, which was not naturally found in eastern England. While some of this silver came from the continent, much of it appears to have been recycled from the existing wealth of Roman Britain. In contrast to the Franks, who settled on the borders and left much of Inner Gaul untouched, the Anglo-Saxon newcomers moved into Britain's most fertile and valuable lowlands. They seized control of key maritime routes, severing connections between the island's most Romanized zones and the rest of the former empire. By the late 5th and 6th centuries, high concentrations of material wealth are found in these now English regions. This suggests that the invaders were drawing heavily on the remaining wealth of Roman Britain, building their early economy on looting and tribute. This also explains why individuals from Western Britain appear in Anglo-Saxon cemeteries, the result of either forced migration, assimilation, or tribute in the form of people as well as goods. The conditions in Britain during the early post-Roman period were significantly different from those in Gaul. The elites in Britain's lowlands were less capable of negotiating or adapting to the rise of barbarian military power than their counterparts across the Channel. Gildas mentions groups of Britons, likely from the upper classes, fleeing overseas while singing psalms, indicating that some members of the educated Christian elite left the region altogether. Others found refuge in upland zones, suggesting that certain wealthy families chose to relocate rather than confront the new power dynamics in the lowlands. However, this migration did not mean that the lowlands were emptied. Evidence from genetic studies, plant remains, and landscape archaeology all point to a considerable degree of continuity between late Roman and early Anglo-Saxon Britain. Many medieval field systems appear to have developed directly from earlier Roman ones. The relative scarcity of material culture from this period isn't surprising, given the general collapse in the production and use of identifiable artifacts after the Roman withdrawal. Both settlement and burial archaeology are particularly thin for Western Britain in the early Middle Ages. Even so, scattered non-Germanic objects such as specific pin types hint at a lingering British presence in the archaeological record. Additionally, early Anglo-Saxon metalwork was clearly influenced by Romano-British styles and techniques, including the use of enamel, punched decoration, and millefiori glass, which were either unknown or rare in Germanic regions. This suggests that immigrant groups relied on and employed local craftsmen who adapted their skills to new cultural tastes. The institutions of late Roman Britain were fundamentally different from those that emerged under Anglo-Saxon rule. Roman society had separated civil and military powers, enforced law through professional courts, maintained systems of landholding, relied on elite networks of patronage, and followed a Christian religious structure. All of these were rapidly weakened or replaced following Anglo-Saxon dominance. Latin lost its role as a language of authority and was displaced by Old English. The once thriving Roman villa system collapsed early in the 5th century, and the rural workforce was restructured to support a new and very different kind of economy and social hierarchy. Roman civil law gave way to Germanic legal customs, where disputes were managed through traditional rules, compensation, and kin-based justice. The old social order crumbled, and Christian authority lost its former influence. The new society was defined by a reintegration of landholding and military power, with freemen holding both authority and responsibility for violence, organized through kin groups and warbands. This societal shift took place during a period of environmental decline, marked by a colder and wetter climate. Rising water levels led to the expansion of marshes and the abandonment of some low-lying areas. Though population levels likely dropped, the decline may not have been as catastrophic as once thought. The crisis is reflected in changing settlement patterns, as many Roman sites were left behind in favor of new Anglo-Saxon ones. These new villages were structured around large timber halls that reveal the emergence of a new kind of social order. Linguistic evidence shows that these households were led by freemen, known as ceorls in early law codes. The term also meant husband and was linked to the establishment of a family through marriage, suggesting that forming a household was tied to status and independence. These quarrels could bear arms, attend public meetings, and take part in community rituals. Their status was reflected in their burials, which often included weapons, while the women of these households were buried with jewelry and other signs of prestige. Landholding in early Anglo-Saxon England was based on a unit called the hide, defined as the amount of land needed to support a ceoral and his household. Bede later described it as the land of a family. It wasn't a small peasant plot, but a substantial estate with workers and dependents. Those at the bottom of this structure, likely including many native Britons, were in varying degrees of unfreedom. Gildas writes that some Britons surrendered themselves to the Saxons and became slaves permanently. Over time, these individuals were absorbed into the Anglo-Saxon rural population, though they may have remained identifiable as the Old English word for a Briton was wal, which eventually came to mean slave or servant, giving rise to the modern word Welsh. This transformation says much about the social dynamics of early Anglo-Saxon England. Although many of the people within this new society were likely of British descent, they occupied lower rungs on the social ladder. Ethnic identity was fluid, but movement within society was mostly in one direction, toward integration into a Germanic culture that placed little value on British heritage. The term hide itself was unique to England and doesn't appear in continental sources, emphasizing its importance in shaping a distinct insular society. As time passed, these households absorbed individuals regardless of their background and gradually transformed them into Anglo-Saxons. A household's success depended heavily on the public standing of its leader, whose authority rested on his claim to Germanic ancestry and membership in an Anglo-Saxon kin group. Access to wealth, influence, and legal protection was tied to being recognized as fully part of this identity. A law code written around 690 by King Ine of Wessex shows that British individuals had access to the legal system, but their vergild, or compensatory value, was only half that of their Saxon counterparts. This racially tiered legal structure has been compared to apartheid-era South Africa, where legal and economic disparity led native populations to steadily lose their land and status. Similar disparities were found in some continental legal systems, where Romans were valued less than the incoming barbarian groups. As Bede later suggested, language became a primary marker of identity in early Anglo-Saxon England. In a world where legal rights, social inclusion, and access to protection were limited to those who claimed Germanic ancestry, speaking Old English without traces of Latin or Brittonic became vital. Anglo-Saxon elites had a strong incentive to avoid adopting words or sounds that might hint at British origins, even going so far as to resist using older names for places. This helped ensure that the influence of earlier British languages on Old English remained limited. Over time, those at lower social levels adopted unaccented English as a way to assimilate, eventually allowing themselves and their descendants to be seen as true Anglo-Saxons. The transition from late Roman Britain to early Anglo-Saxon society did not occur all at once or evenly across the landscape. Instead, the process unfolded gradually and differently depending on the region. The early Anglo-Saxon world lacked the kind of centralized hierarchies that might have enabled a rapid or total transformation. Instead, kin-based communities operated locally, forming small-scale tribal units, while armed bands pushed outward into new territories. These early societies often revolved around clusters of households, centered on communal gathering and burial areas. The uneven distribution of early Anglo-Saxon artifacts suggests that some regions felt their presence more than others, and in many places, the native population continued largely undisturbed for some time. Localized evidence shows that some British districts remained under native control well into the early Anglo-Saxon period. In places like Wareham, pre-English carved stones survive, while areas such as Wiltshire, Lancashire, and West Yorkshire retain high concentrations of pre-English place names. Older religious practices continued in places like St. Albans, indicating cultural persistence alongside transformation. Although these regions may have avoided outright conquest, they likely still paid tribute to the new powers. Place names containing the element wall, such as Walton or Wallasey, may signal communities once led by Britons, though the term also appears in personal names, which complicates the picture. Over time, even those communities that retained distinctively British cultural features began to adopt the language and customs of the Anglo-Saxon world. This pattern of gradual, small-scale change explains the fragmented political landscape of 5th and 6th century England. In Gaul, the Frankish kingdom was built on the existing Roman civitas framework, which survived into the medieval period as bishoprics and local jurisdictions. In contrast, early English tribal names rarely connect directly with Roman administrative divisions. Kent, derived from Cantium, is a rare exception. Some names, like Lindsey and the Rotensat, preserve memories of earlier Roman centers, but many others, such as Elmet and Dira, are of uncertain origin and may have arisen only after Roman authority had vanished. These names tended to represent groups of people rather than the land itself, emphasizing the social fabric of kinship and tribal identity over fixed territorial boundaries. The collapse of Roman administration gave way to a new form of localism, what some have called a return to tribalism, where both English and British groups developed small, kin-based political communities. In this emerging society, individuals likely carried multiple overlapping identities. At its core was the family, claiming descent from Germanic ancestors and occupying land known as Hydes. From there, the web of kinship expanded through both paternal and maternal ties. A man's involvement in a war band also shaped his sense of belonging, connecting him with a military leader and his wider network. Beyond that, sea orls participated in managing the local landscape, helping define tribal territory. These layers of affiliation extended outward to larger groupings and ultimately to a shared Germanic identity, which set them apart from the remaining Britons. Whereas Roman Britain had emphasized the individual through its legal system, religious practices, and citizenship, Anglo-Saxon England shifted toward collective identity rooted in family and lineage. Legal and social status were now inherited through kinship rather than defined by personal achievement. This emphasis stood in stark contrast to Roman values and persisted in England even as other parts of Europe adopted aspects of Roman law and Christianity. Early Anglo-Saxon legal codes, which emerged around the year 600, were written in the vernacular and remained grounded in tribal custom. The closest continental parallels to this society are found not in Gaul or Spain, but in the Balkans, where the Slavic migrations had similarly dismantled Roman structures. There, as in England, a simpler kin-based society took hold, lacking professional classes, coinage, urban trade centers, or centralized bureaucracies. This marks the complete departure from the Roman world and the rise of a new social order grounded in kin, land, and local power.